The entire town of Liberty gathered that morning in front of the old courthouse. Spring had just broken through winter's grip across the Montana Territory, but a lingering chill hung in the air, not from the weather, but from what was about to transpire. Sheriff Thomas Riley stood on the courthouse steps beside County Clerk Wilbur Simmons, who clutched a wooden gavel and a yellowed piece of parchment. Behind them loomed Judge Wallace Porter, his face set like granite eyes, darting nervously across the crowd. "Auction to commence for the property known as Whispering Creek Cabin," Simmons announced, his voice cracking slightly. 12 acres of land, with existing dwelling barn and well. Starting bid 12 cents. A murmur rippled through the crowd. 12 cents for 12 acres was no price at all. It was practically being given away. Yet not a single hand went up. The well-heeled traders, the wealthy ranch owners, they all stood frozen like statues. Simmons cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Item comes with no guarantees of title clarity, sold as is, no refunds under any circumstances." He paused, adding quietly, "Buyer assumes all associated complications." The crowd shifted uneasily. Children were ushered behind skirts and trouser legs. Men adjusted their gun belts, and women clutched their shawls tighter. At the back of the gathering stood Gideon Hale, a weathered man of 45 with silver-flecked beard and deep-set eyes that had seen too much of life's cruelty. His left leg carried a permanent limp from a Minier ball at Gettysburg, and beside him sat a graying wolfhound named Ranger, as battle-scarred as his master. Gideon had ridden into Liberty just 3 days prior, with nothing but his horse, his dog, a Winchester rifle, and a small herd of scraggly cattle he'd acquired along the Montana Trail. He needed land, any land, and 12 cents was exactly what he could afford. 12 cents! Gideon called out, his voice rough like gravel under a boot heel. Every head turned. But instead of envy, what filled their eyes was pity, as if he had just volunteered for his own hanging. "Do I hear anything higher?" Simmons called out, his voice echoing awkwardly. Sheriff Riley scanned the crowd, hand resting on his revolver, seemingly ready for trouble that didn't come. Judge Porter simply closed his eyes, as if witnessing a tragedy he couldn't prevent. "Going once," Simmons called. The silence deepened. "Going twice." A woman near the front made the sign of the cross. "Sold to the gentleman in the back." "May God have mercy on you, sir." The gavel came down with finality. Thud, like a coffin nail being driven home. As the crowd dispersed, Gideon approached the courthouse steps. He counted out 12 pennies, nearly half of what he possessed in the world, and placed them in Simmons's reluctant hand. "Sign here, Mr. Hale, Gideon Hale." As he signed the deed, an elderly man in a preacher's collar approached. Reverend Abernathy was stooped with age, his face deeply lined, eyes milky with cataracts. "Son," he said, laying a gnarled hand on Gideon's arm, "you're buying death. That cabin has buried 3 men already." Gideon met the old man's clouded gaze. "With respect, Reverend Death and I are old acquaintances." The preacher shook his head sadly. "Not like this. Samuel Hartwell wasn't the first to die there, but how he died. They strung him up from his own gate when he tried to speak the truth." Gideon tucked the deed into his coat. "What truth?" "About the land, the silver, the forged documents." The preacher lowered his voice. "About what Colonel Blackwood and Judge Crane did to the Apache people at Whispering Creek." Sheriff Riley appeared beside them, his hand still hovering near his gun. "That's enough ghost stories, Reverend. Mr. Hale here has made his purchase." He turned to Gideon. "Cabins about 8 miles east follow the creek trail. I'd get there before sundown if I were you. These hills get mighty dangerous after dark." As Gideon mounted his horse, he felt eyes boring into his back. Judge Porter watched from the courthouse door, his expression unreadable. Beside him stood a tall man in an expensive black coat and wide-brimmed hat trimmed with silver. The man's face bore a scar that ran from temple to jaw, his eyes cold as a snake's. "Who's that with the judge?" Gideon asked Sheriff Riley, nodding toward the man. Riley's face tightened. "Colonel James Blackwood. Used to command the 7th Cavalry Unit stationed near here during the Apache conflicts. Now he works for the Continental Railroad as their regional problem solver. Best give him a wide berth, hail." Gideon nodded, nudged his horse forward. Ranger trotted alongside as they headed out of Liberty, the weight of those staring eyes following them like a curse. The trail to Whispering Creek wound through sparse pine forest and rocky outcroppings. As the elevation climbed, Gideon found himself surrounded by a landscape both beautiful and forbidding, much like the life he'd led since the war took everything from him. He'd been a farmer before the conflict with fertile land in Pennsylvania, a young wife named Sarah, and an infant son. When the call to arms came, he'd joined the Union forces believing in the cause. 4 years later, he returned home to find his farm burned, his wife and child dead from fever. There was nothing left for him in the East, so he drifted westward, taking odd jobs as ranch hand bounty hunter and occasionally deputy marshal when times were desperate. 10 years of wandering had left him empty, his soul as barren as the western plains in winter. This 12-cent cabin represented his last chance at putting down roots, at building something that might outlast him. The memory of his last night in Pennsylvania came unbidden as he rode Sarah's grave beside little Thomas's 2 crude wooden crosses on a hill overlooking what remained of their farm. He'd knelt there in the rain mud soaking through his uniform pants and made a promise he hadn't kept to find meaning again, to rebuild what war had taken. Instead, he'd let grief harden into a shell around him, keeping out both pain and purpose. Each mile westward had been another step away from that promise until he became a ghost, drifting through frontier towns, taking what work would feed him, and Ranger never staying long enough to form connections. "Not much of a legacy for a man pushing 50, he muttered to the empty trail. Ranger's ears perked up at his voice, the dog glancing back as if in agreement. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Gideon crested a rise and saw his property for the first time. The cabin stood in a small clearing beside a burbling creek, its log walls weathered gray by seasons of sun and snow. A split-rail fence encircled a yard of tall grass, and beyond it stood a small barn, its door hanging askew. In the fading light, it looked peaceful enough. Then Ranger growled, the deep rumble of warning rising from the dog's chest. Gideon drew his Winchester from its saddle scabbard and approached cautiously. As he neared the gate, he saw what had disturbed his companion. A man hung from the gate's crossbeam, but not just any man. He was Apache, elderly, but powerful, his body adorned with the traditional tattoos of a warrior. His buckskins were torn and bloody, his face beaten nearly beyond recognition. Most disturbing of all, his chest still rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. This was no old corpse. This man had been strung up recently and left to die slowly. Gideon quickly dismounted, knife already in hand. The Apache's eyes cracked open as Gideon cut the rope. They burned with a fierce intelligence despite his condition, and something else, recognition. "Hold on," Gideon muttered, catching the man's heavy frame as he collapsed. "I've got you." The Apache tried to speak, blood bubbling at his lips, but only managed a raspy whisper in his native tongue. Gideon half-carried, half-dragged the man into the cabin, kicking the door open with his boot. Inside, dust motes swirled in shafts of evening light, filtering through boarded windows. The place had been ransacked. Furniture overturned, floorboards pried up in places, walls gouged, as if someone had been searching frantically for something hidden. He laid the Apache on a worn wooden table, the only piece of furniture still intact, and set about examining his wounds. Rope burns had cut deep into his neck, and his body bore evidence of severe beating, broken ribs, possibly internal bleeding. The man was dying. Gideon had seen enough battlefield wounds to know the signs. "Who did this to you?" Gideon asked, though he doubted the man understood English or had strength to answer. To his surprise, the Apache responded in perfect, albeit strained, English. "Blackwood's men. They wanted to know where my daughter hid the papers." Gideon tore strips from his spare shirt to bind the worst wounds. "Your daughter?" Singing bird. She worked with Hartwell, the geologist. Each word seemed to cost the man tremendous effort. "I am Two Ravens, last war chief of the Chiricahua at Whispering Creek." Gideon's hands stilled. The Whispering Creek massacre was 5 years ago. The Army reported no survivors. Two Ravens' laugh turned into a wet cough. "The Army lies. My daughter survived. I survived. We scattered like seeds in the wind." His hand clutched Gideon's wrist with surprising strength. "Why are you helping me? You wear a soldier's bearing." "I was a soldier once, not anymore." Gideon offered his canteen to the dying man. "And I never much cared for those who'd string up a man to die slow, soldier or not." Two Ravens drank painfully water mixing with blood. "They will come back when they find you helped me. Blackwood wants what Hartwell found." "And what was that?" "Silver. A mountain of it, beneath our sacred land." Two Ravens' breathing became more labored. "But more than silver. Proof, documents showing the treaties were real, that the land was never for sale." Gideon glanced at the torn-up floorboards. "They were looking for these papers." Two Ravens nodded weakly. "Hartwell discovered the fraud. Railroad and government men forged documents, sold our land many times over. Hartwell tried to expose them. They hanged him from that same gate. But before he died, he and my daughter hid the evidence." Outside, darkness had fallen completely. Ranger paced by the door, occasionally growling at sounds from the forest. Gideon lit a lantern he'd found, casting the cabin's interior in flickering golden light that made the shadows dance like restless spirits. "Your daughter," Gideon said. "Where is she now?" "Blackwood has her. At the old mining camp, 3 miles north." Two Ravens' eyes grew desperate. "You must find her before they break her. She knows where everything is hidden." "I'm no hero, old man. I came here to start a cattle ranch, not wage war against the U.S. Army and the railroad." Two Ravens smiled through bloodied teeth. 12 cents for this cabin. You think that was accident? The spirits guided you here for a reason." His hand moved to a leather pouch at his waist. "Take this." Gideon opened the small pouch, finding a piece of tanned deerskin inside. Upon it was drawn a detailed map marked with strange symbols and what appeared to be Apache writing. "The silver mine location. Hartwell made it before they killed him." Two Ravens' voice grew fainter. "Worth millions, but cursed with blood. Find my daughter. Save her. Bring justice." Two Ravens' eyes drifted to the ceiling, focusing on something Gideon couldn't see. He began to sing softly in his native tongue, a death song that raised the hairs on Gideon's neck. The melody drifted through the cabin like smoke, ancient and powerful. Then, mid-verse, two ravens stopped. His chest stilled. The fierce intelligence in his eyes faded to glass. Gideon sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the dead man's request heavy on his shoulders. This wasn't his fight. He'd come to Montana to escape his past, not to charge headlong into someone else's war. A sound outside snapped him from his thoughts. Ranger's growl deepened, his hackles rising. Gideon extinguished the lantern and moved to the window, peering through a crack in the boards. Moonlight illuminated three riders observing the cabin from the tree line. The leader sat tall in his saddle, and even at this distance Gideon could make out the distinctive silver trim on his hat. Colonel Blackwood had wasted no time in coming to check on his handiwork, only to find his victim cut down and taken inside. As Gideon watched, Blackwood raised a spyglass to his eye, scanning the darkened cabin. After a moment, he lowered it and spoke to his companions. They turned their horses and disappeared into the forest, but Gideon knew they weren't leaving, just repositioning, perhaps surrounding the property. He checked his Winchester's load and the Colt revolver at his hip. 12 cents had bought him more than a cabin and 12 acres. It had bought him a war. Ranger padded to his side, pressing against his leg in silent solidarity. Gideon ran a hand through the dog's coarse fur. "Looks like we've found ourselves another fight, old friend," he murmured, "just when we thought we were done with fighting." In the stillness of the cabin, with a dead Apache war chief on his table and killers circling outside, Gideon Hale felt something stir within him that he thought had died at Gettysburg Purpose. He moved two Ravens' body to a corner, covering it respectfully with a dusty blanket he'd found in the ruins of what must have been a bedroom. Then he began to barricade the door and windows, preparing for the siege that would surely come with dawn. Sleep came in fitful bursts that night. Each time Gideon closed his eyes, he saw two Ravens' face transform into those of other dead men soldiers from both sides at Gettysburg, faces contorted in agony. His young son, cheeks hollow with fever, and Samuel Hartwell, a man he'd never met, but could imagine swinging from the same gate where two ravens had hung. Sometime past midnight, Gideon gave up on rest and sat by the cabin's single unboarded window, Winchester across his lap. Ranger lay at his feet, alert despite the late-hour ears twitching at every night sound. The moon had risen high, bathing the clearing in silver light that reminded Gideon of two ravens' words about the mine. He unfolded the deerskin map, studying it by moonlight. The markings were a mix of Apache symbols and English notations, presumably Hartwell's additions. A large X marked what must be the silver deposit located beneath a formation labeled Wolf's Fang, a jagged outcropping visible from the cabin's north window. Below the map were words written in a cramped, educated hand. The documents prove everything. Find them where blood and water meet. A riddle, or perhaps instructions meant only for two ravens and his daughter to understand. Gideon refolded the map, tucking it into his shirt pocket. Its existence was dangerous enough, its meaning potentially deadly. Dawn was still hours away, but Gideon's mind turned to the mining camp three ravens had mentioned. If Singing Bird was there each passing hour, meant more time for Blackwood's men to extract information from her by whatever means necessary. The thought of what might be happening to her gnawed at him. He'd seen enough during the war to know what men were capable of when unrestricted by law or decency. The frontier amplified those tendencies, distance from civilization providing cover for all manner of barbarism, particularly against those deemed uncivilized themselves. "Damn it all," he muttered, standing abruptly. Ranger looked up, expectant. It went against all survival instinct to leave the relative safety of the cabin, but something stronger than instinct drove him now. Perhaps it was the old sense of duty that had led him to enlist all those years ago. Perhaps it was simply that he'd watched too many die without raising a hand to stop it. He gathered his gear quickly, ammunition canteen, what little food he had. After a moment's hesitation, he took a small wooden box from his saddlebag, opening it to reveal a tarnished silver star, his old deputy marshal's badge from a brief stint in Kansas. He pinned it inside his coat, not visible but there, a reminder of the man he'd once tried to be. "Guard the fort," he told Ranger, patting the dog's head. "I'll be back by dawn." But the wolfhound whined, clearly disagreeing with the plan. "Fine," Gideon relented, "but stay close and quiet." He slipped out through a back window, Winchester in hand, Ranger following silently. The night air bit cold as they skirted the edge of the clearing, staying within the tree line. Blackwood's men were out there somewhere, but Gideon had spent enough years tracking both men and game to know how to move unseen. The old mining camp lay 3 miles north, according to 2 ravens, in the silver moonlight with the Wolf's Fang Peak, as his guide Gideon set out through terrain that was now legally his, though he felt more like a trespasser than ever. Each step took him deeper into a conflict he didn't understand, for people he didn't know, against enemies far more powerful than himself. Logic said to ride away, to abandon this blood-soaked land and the 12 cents he'd spent on it. But logic had little to do with the choices that defined a man's character. And after years of drifting, perhaps Gideon Hale was finally ready to remember what kind of man he truly was. The mining camp appeared first as a faint orange glow against the night sky. Campfires or lanterns burning despite the late hour. Gideon approached cautiously, Ranger slinking low beside him. They took position on a ridge overlooking the camp, and Gideon studied the layout through his rifle's scope. The camp consisted of 5 structures, 3 small cabins, a stable, and what appeared to be an old assay office, the largest building, its windows illuminated. 4 men patrolled the perimeter, rifles slung across their backs. 2 more sat by a campfire near the center, passing a bottle between them. All wore the garb of frontier mercenaries, a mix of civilian clothes and surplus military gear. Movement at the assay office caught Gideon's eye. The door opened, and out stepped Colonel Blackwood himself, recognizable by his distinctive hat even at this distance. He spoke to one of the guards, then headed toward the furthest cabin. "That's where they're keeping her," Gideon thought. He watched as Blackwood entered the cabin, stayed for perhaps 10 minutes, then emerged, looking frustrated. The colonel stalked back to the assay office, barking orders at the men by the fire, who quickly doused it and took up positions near the cabin. Singing Bird was still alive then, and still holding out against whatever methods Blackwood was using to make her talk. Gideon retreated back from the ridge, considering his options. 6 armed men plus Blackwood, all likely experienced killers, against 1 aging ex-soldier with a limp and a dog. The odds were decidedly poor. A frontal assault was suicide. Stealth was his only advantage, and even that relied on considerable luck. He needed a distraction. "What do you think, boy?" he whispered to Ranger. "Feel like raising some hell." The dog tilted his head, ears forward. Gideon formulated a plan as he circled the camp, approaching the stables from the blind side of the ridge. Inside were 4 horses dozing in their stalls. He slipped in through a back door, Ranger following silently. "Go on now," he urged the wolfhound. "Get them riled up." Ranger needed no further encouragement. He darted forward, barking and snapping at the horses' legs. The animals woke in panic, whinnying and kicking at their stalls. Gideon quickly cut their tethers, then slapped each horse hard on the flank. They bolted from the stable in a thunder of hooves, Ranger driving them forward with continued barking. Shouts of alarm rose from the camp. Gideon used the confusion to slip along the shadows toward the far cabin. 2 guards had left their posts to chase the horses, while the others were distracted by the commotion. He moved quickly, keeping low, his bad leg protesting with each step. Reaching the cabin, he peered through a grimy window. Inside, illuminated by a single lantern, lay a woman bound to a crude wooden chair. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, but she held herself with defiance. Singing bird. Gideon tried the door and found it locked. Drawing his knife, he worked the simple latch mechanism from the outside, a trick he'd learned from a less than reputable companion during his bounty hunting days. The lock gave with a soft click. He slipped inside immediately, pressing a finger to his lips, when Singing Bird's good eye widened at his entrance. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 30, with intelligent features and the same fierce gaze as her father. 2 ravens sent me, he whispered, cutting her bonds with quick strokes of his knife. I'm Gideon Hale. My father, she began, her voice hoarse. He didn't make it. I'm sorry. Her face hardened grief, flashing briefly before being replaced by cold determination. Did he tell you about the documents? Some. He gave me the map. She nodded, rising unsteadily to her feet. Then we need to go now. Blackwood suspects, but doesn't know. The door burst open. A guard stood framed in the doorway, momentarily frozen in surprise. Gideon reacted first, driving his shoulder into the man's chest and sending them both tumbling outside. They hit the ground hard, the guard's rifle clattering away. The man was younger, stronger, unhampered by old wounds. He rolled, pinning Gideon beneath him, hands going for his throat. Spots danced in Gideon's vision as the guard's thumbs pressed into his windpipe. A sharp crack split the air. The guard's grip slackened suddenly, his eyes going wide with shock. He toppled sideways, revealing Singing Bird standing behind him. Gideon's own dropped Colt revolver smoking in her hands. I told my father I wouldn't kill again, she said, her voice flat. I'm glad he didn't live to see me break that promise. Shouts approached from multiple directions. Gideon scrambled to his feet, reclaiming his revolver from Singing Bird. We need to run, he said. Now. They fled toward the tree line, shots ringing out behind them. Gideon fired back twice, not aiming to hit, but to slow pursuit. Ranger materialized from the darkness, leading them up a barely visible game trail into the mountains. Behind them, the camp erupted into chaos. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness as Blackwood's men gave chase, their shouts echoing through the night. But the wolfhound led them true following paths no human eye could discern in the darkness. After an hour of hard travel, they stopped in a small box canyon, momentarily safe. Singing Bird collapsed against a boulder, her reserves of strength finally depleted. Gideon offered his canteen, which she drank from gratefully. Thank you, she said finally, for my father, for coming for me. Don't thank me yet, Gideon replied, checking his ammunition. We're a long way from safe. No one is safe as long as Blackwood has power. She handed back the canteen. The documents my father spoke of, they prove that Judge Crane and Governor Webb forged land treaties not just for our tribe, but for 3 others. They sold the same parcels multiple times to different mining interests, railroad companies, and Eastern investors. And the silver mine, just the beginning. The railroad plans to build a new line through the territory, a project worth tens of millions. But the right-of-way crosses land that was protected by federal treaty. Our land. Gideon absorbed this information, understanding now the scale of what he'd stumbled into. This wasn't just about local corruption or even the murder of a few men. This was systematic fraud at the highest levels of territorial government with money enough to buy men like Blackwood to eliminate any threats. "The documents," he asked, "where are they?" Singing Bird hesitated, studying him carefully. "Why should I trust you with that? You're a white man, former military. For all I know, you work for Blackwood. I just killed one of his men helping you escape." Perhaps that was the plan all along. Gain my trust, learn what my father wouldn't tell them under torture. Gideon couldn't fault her logic. He'd have suspected the same in her position. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said finally. "But I'm all you've got right now. And I gave your father my word." She was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "The documents are hidden in 3 places. One set beneath the floorboards in Samuel Hartwell's bedroom at the cabin. Another in Judge Crane's office in Redemption. And the third—" She touched a leather cord around her neck, pulling out a small brass key. "In a lockbox buried where blood and water meet." "The riddle from Hartwell's map," Gideon said. "Yes, Samuel was clever. He knew they'd search obvious places." Ranger's ears suddenly perked up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Distant voices echoed from the canyon entrance, Blackwood's men closing in. "We need to move," Gideon said, helping Singing Bird to her feet. "Where they'll have men watching your cabin by now." Gideon considered their options, all of them poor. "Redemption," he decided. "The judge's office. We get those documents first, then figure out our next move. Redemption is Blackwood's territory. The sheriff there is in his pocket. Then we'll have to be smarter than them." He checked the position of the stars. "It's 4 hours till dawn. If we push hard, we can reach Redemption by midday tomorrow." They set off deeper into the mountains, following game trails and dried creek beds, staying off the main paths where Blackwood's men would be searching. The night grew colder as they climbed, their breath fogging in the moonlight. Gideon felt the familiar rhythm of pursuit and evasion settling into his bones, a dance he'd performed too many times as both hunter and hunted. But this time, the stakes seemed higher than they had in years. Not just his life, but justice for 2 ravens, for Samuel Hartwell, for the Apache, who'd been massacred at Whispering Creek. And perhaps, though he barely admitted it to himself, a chance to fulfill that rain-soaked promise made at Sarah's grave, to find meaning again, to rebuild what war had taken. Dawn would reveal whether that chance would be realized, or whether his 12-cent gamble would end with his own body hanging from the gate of Whispering Creek cabin. The town of Redemption lived down to its name, a place where men sought absolution not through prayer, but through whiskey and willing women. Unlike the more genteel Liberty, Redemption had grown haphazardly around several played-out silver mines, attracting those who preferred to live beyond the reach of law and civility. Gideon and Singing Bird approached cautiously, having spent a grueling night evading Blackwood's men in the mountains. They'd traveled cross-country, avoiding trails, finally reaching a ridge overlooking Redemption as the midday sun beat down mercilessly. "Not exactly the pearly gates," Gideon muttered, surveying the town through his rifle scope. Redemption consisted of one main street, muddy and rutted, lined with false-fronted buildings, saloons outnumbering all other establishments combined. Men in varying states of drunkenness staggered between them despite the early hour. At the far end stood a 2-story structure with a sign proclaiming it the Territorial Court and Sheriff's Office. "Judge Crane's domain," Singing Bird said, her voice tight, "and Sheriff Miller's, both bought and paid for by Blackwood and Governor Webb." "You've been here before." "Once with Samuel Hartwell. He tried to file a report about the forged documents." Her face darkened. "Sheriff Miller laughed him out of town. A week later, Samuel was hanging from the gate at Whispering Creek." Gideon lowered his scope. Singing Bird looked even worse. In daylight, her face bruised, clothes, torn, exhaustion etched in every line of her body. Yet she carried herself with dignity, her eyes alert and focused. "We can't just walk in there," Gideon said. "Blackwood's surely telegraphed ahead. They'll be watching for us." Singing Bird nodded toward a decrepit cabin on the town's outskirts. "Clara Hayes lives there. Her husband was Federal Marshal Robert Hayes. He was investigating Crane and Webb when he was killed last month. Official report called it suicide. And unofficially, he was shot in the back of the head while kneeling. Some suicide." Gideon grunted. He'd heard of Hayes, an honest lawman in a territory where such men were endangered species. "You think his widow will help us? She has reason to hate the same men we do." They circled around to approach the Hayes cabin from the back, keeping to gullies and brush where possible. Ranger scouted ahead, his gray coat blending with the scrub. When they finally reached the cabin's back door, Gideon kept his Winchester ready, while Singing Bird knocked softly. The door opened a crack, revealing a wary blue eye and the barrel of a shotgun. "Who are you?" a woman's voice demanded. "My name is Singing Bird. I worked with Samuel Hartwell. This is Gideon Hale. We need to speak with you about your husband's investigation." A moment's hesitation, then the door swung open. Clara Hayes was a handsome woman in her 40s, her blonde hair streaked with gray, her face lined but strong. She wore men's trousers and a man's shirt, both too large for her frame, her husband's clothes, Gideon guessed. "Inside," she said, glancing past them. "Quickly." Once the door was secured, Clara lowered the shotgun, but kept it within reach. Her home was sparse but neat, with stacks of papers covering a small table, what appeared to be official documents and newspaper clippings. "You're the Apache woman Hartwell mentioned," Clara said, studying Singing Bird. "And you," she turned to Gideon, "you look like you've ridden a hard trail." 12 cents bought me more trouble than I bargained for," he replied briefly, explaining his purchase of the cabin and the events that followed. Clara's expression hardened as he described finding 2 ravens. "Blackwood's work. He did similar to my Robert." She moved to the table, shifting through papers. "My husband was close, had nearly everything he needed to bring down Crane Webb and their whole operation. Then he turned up dead, and the Territorial Marshal's office suddenly lost interest in the case." "We need the documents from Crane's office," Singing Bird said. "My father died protecting their location. Combined with what Samuel and I hid at the cabin and at Whispering Creek, they prove everything." Clara pulled out a worn leather folio. Robert made copies of everything he found. Maps of land parcels sold multiple times, bank transfers to offshore accounts, witness statements about the Apache massacre. She laid out several papers, but the originals, the ones with official seals and signatures, those would be in Crane's safe. Gideon examined a map showing overlapping land claims. "How do we get to them?" "You don't," Clara said flatly. "Not during daylight. The courthouse is always guarded. Crane may be corrupt, but he's not stupid." "And at night," Singing Bird pressed. Clara hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Robert discovered a cellar entrance. The courthouse was built on the foundation of an old trading post. There's a tunnel that leads from the livery stable to the basement. "A convenient escape route for a corrupt judge," Gideon noted. "Exactly." Clara produced a crude diagram. "This shows the way. But listen carefully. Miller's deputies patrol the streets at night. 4 men rotating every 2 hours. And Crane himself stays at the Golden Palace Hotel, just across from the courthouse." Gideon studied the diagram. "We'll need a distraction." "I might be able to help with that." Clara's smile was cold. "I've been planning something for weeks. Just needed the right moment." A sudden scratching at the door made them all freeze. Ranger, who'd been lying quietly by Gideon's feet, lifted his head but didn't growl. Clara relaxed slightly. "That'll be Micah," she said, opening the door to admit a boy of about 12, skinny and dirt-smudged. "Mrs. Hayes, there's riders coming in from the East Trail," the boy reported breathlessly. "Blackwood himself and 5 men. They're stopping at all the saloons, showing a drawing of a man and an Indian woman, offering $50 for information." Gideon and Singing Bird exchanged glances. Blackwood had moved faster than expected. "The courthouse?" Clara asked. "2 deputies out front now. Sheriff Miller's with Blackwood at the palace." Clara pressed a coin into the boy's hand. "Good work, Micah. Stay out of sight, but keep your ears open." When the boy had gone, Clara turned to her guests. "You'll have to stay here until dark. Bedroom's through there." She nodded toward a door. "Get some rest. You look like you need it." Gideon woke to the sound of rain drumming on the roof. He'd fallen into exhausted sleep on Clara's spare bed. Singing Bird, taking the floor despite his protests. Ranger lay across the threshold, ever vigilant. The room had darkened, but whether from the storm or approaching evening, he couldn't tell. He checked his pocket watch, just past 6. They'd slept several hours. Singing Bird was already awake, sitting cross-legged by the window, watching raindrops trace patterns on the glass. She looked small and vulnerable in the gray light, but when she turned to him, her eyes held the same fierce determination he'd seen in her father. "Tell me about the man you were," she said quietly, "before the 12 cents. Gideon sat up, rubbing his face. "Not much to tell. Soldier, husband, father, failed at all 3. Failed how? He hadn't spoken of Sarah and Thomas to anyone in years, but something in Singing Bird's direct gaze drew the words from him. "I was fighting in Pennsylvania while they were dying in Pennsylvania. Fever took them both. I wasn't there. War took you away. That's not failure. Isn't it? A man protects what's his. I chose a cause over my family. And after..." Gideon shrugged. "Drifted. Took whatever work kept me in whiskey and ammunition. Tried being a lawman for a spell in Kansas. Didn't stick. Why not? Found out the man who hired me, town marshal, was taking bribes from cattle rustlers. I confronted him. Things got messy. You killed him. He pulled first." Gideon flexed his right hand, remembering. "Haven't worn a badge since." Singing Bird nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "My father was right about you. He didn't know me. He knew your kind, men who carry guilt like a second skin." She rose, moving to sit beside him on the bed. "My people believe that souls can be reborn not just after death, but within a single life. Perhaps the spirits brought you to Whispering Creek to be reborn." Gideon wasn't one for mysticism, but something in her words resonated uncomfortably. "Or perhaps 12 cents was all I could afford." She smiled slightly. "Perhaps?" A knock interrupted them. Clara entered, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "It's time," she said. "Blackwood and Miller are at the Golden Palace dining with Judge Crane. My distraction is ready whenever you are." They gathered around Clara's table where she'd laid out her husband's diagrams of the courthouse. "The tunnel entrance is here behind the livery stable," she explained, pointing. "It leads directly to the basement of the courthouse. Crane's office is on the 2nd floor northeast corner. The safe is behind a painting of President Grant." "What kind of safe?" Gideon asked. "Standard Remington model. 4-tumbler combination." Singing Bird touched the diagrams. "I can open it. Samuel taught me. He was unconventional in his skills." "And your distraction?" Gideon asked Clara. A smile played at her lips. Let's just say the Golden Palace will be hosting an unexpected celebration tonight. One that should keep Blackwood Crane and their men quite occupied for at least an hour. And after we get the documents, Singing Bird asked, there's a federal marshal in Cedar Ridge named of Wilson. He's one of the few honest lawmen left in the territory. Robert trusted him. Get the documents to him, and he'll handle the rest. Clara's face hardened. Just make sure Webb and Blackwood pay for Robert, and for your father, and for Hartwell. Gideon nodded, checking his revolver. What about you? Once they realize you helped us. I've made arrangements. Clara handed him a folded paper. This is a letter to Marshal Wilson explaining everything I know. Take it with you. As for me, she patted the shotgun. I don't plan to be taken alive. The conviction in her voice silenced any argument. This was a woman who'd made her peace with what might come. As darkness fell, they made final preparations. Gideon reloaded his Winchester and Colt. While Singing Bird changed into clothes Clara provided less conspicuous than her torn and bloodied garments. Ranger would stay with Clara, much to the dog's apparent displeasure. He'll alert you if anyone approaches, Gideon told her. And he's handy in a fight. Clara nodded, scratching the wolfhound's ears. We'll be fine. Just focus on getting those documents. They slipped out the back door into the rain-soaked night. The storm had intensified, providing ideal cover as they made their way through Redemption's muddy back alleys. The few people brave enough to be out hurried, with heads down against the downpour, paying them no mind. The livery stable stood dark and quiet at the edge of town. Gideon kept watch, while Singing Bird worked on the padlock securing the back door. She manipulated a slender piece of metal with the dexterity of a surgeon, and within moments the lock clicked open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hay and horse manure. Lantern light filtered through from the front area where a stable boy dozed on a stool. They moved silently past stalls of slumbering horses to the back corner Clara had indicated on her diagram. Singing Bird located the trap door hidden beneath a pile of straw. It opened with a protesting creak, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. Ladies first, Gideon whispered, offering her a small tin miner's lamp he'd lit. How gallant, she replied dryly, taking the lamp and starting down the steps. The tunnel was low-ceilinged and damp, forcing Gideon to stoop. Water dripped from the stones above, and the earthen floor was slick with mud. They moved carefully, counting their steps, as Clara had instructed. 112 paces, Singing Bird murmured when they reached a blank stone wall. This should be it. She ran her hands over the stones, pressing one that seemed no different from the others. A section of wall swung inward with surprising ease, revealing a small storage room filled with crates and file boxes. The courthouse basement, Gideon whispered. Crane's office is 2 floors up. They navigated through the basement, finding a narrow servant's staircase that Clara had marked on her diagram. As they ascended, a sudden commotion erupted from the direction of the town's main street shouts. Then a woman's scream followed by the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. Clara's distraction, Gideon surmised. They quickened their pace, reaching the 2nd floor, without encountering anyone. The corridor was dimly lit by a single oil lamp at the far end, the doors to various offices standing silent and dark. Only one door at the corner showed light beneath it, Judge Crane's office. Gideon drew his revolver, approaching cautiously. The sounds of chaos from the street had intensified, suggesting that Clara's celebration was in full swing. It should be empty, Singing Bird whispered. Gideon tried the handle. Locked. Singing Bird again produced her slender metal tools, working the lock with practiced precision. Within moments, They were inside. Crane's office spoke of the man's self-importance. A massive mahogany desk dominated the room, the walls lined with leather-bound law books. Behind the desk hung a gilded portrait of President Grant, exactly as Clara had described. Singing Bird moved it aside, revealing a wall safe. She pressed her ear to it, fingers working the dial with delicate precision. Samuel said these Remingtons all have a manufacturing flaw, she murmured. If you listen carefully, a soft click, then another. The safe door swung open. Inside were stacks of documents, land deeds, bank drafts, and official-looking papers bearing territorial seals. Singing Bird quickly sorted through them, selecting specific items. These are the originals of the forged treaties, she said, tucking several documents into her shirt. And these prove the land transfers were fraudulent. More papers disappeared into her clothing. This is enough to hang Crane Webb and Blackwood. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Gideon motioned for silence, moving to position himself beside the door, revolver ready. The doorknob turned slowly. The door opened, and a deputy stepped in, clearly surprised to find the office occupied. Before he could shout, Gideon brought his revolver butt down hard on the man's temple. The deputy crumpled, unconscious. "Time to go," Gideon said, dragging the deputy inside and closing the door. They retraced their steps, moving more quickly now. The commotion from the street had grown louder, more breaking glass shouts and what sounded like gunfire. "Clara's distraction is getting out of hand," Gideon muttered as they descended the servants' staircase. They had just reached the basement when a voice called out behind them, "Stop right there!" Sheriff Miller stood at the top of the stairs, revolver aimed at their backs. He was a heavy-set man with a drooping mustache and cold eyes. "Well, well," he said, descending slowly. "The Apache woman and her new protector. Blackwood's offering $100 for you now. Dead or alive." Gideon raised his hands slowly, calculating angles and distances. The sheriff's revolver remained steady, trained on Singing Bird's back. "You know what they did, Miller," Gideon said, stalling. "The land fraud, the massacre at Whispering Creek. You're helping murderers." Miller shrugged. "Man's got to make a living. This territory ain't kind to those who don't pick the right side." He gestured with his gun. "Now those papers the woman took, hand them over nice and slow." "And then what?" Singing Bird asked, not turning around. "You'll let us go," Miller laughed. "Not likely, but I might make it quick, which is more than Blackwood would do." Gideon tensed, ready to move. Before he could, a deafening roar filled the basement. Miller's face registered surprise, then pain. He toppled forward, revealing Clara Hayes standing behind him, her husband's shotgun still smoking in her hands. "Nobody's making it quick for anyone tonight," she said grimly. Shouts echoed from above, more deputies drawn by the gunshot. "Go," Clara urged, reloading the shotgun. "The tunnel now. Come with us," Singing Bird pleaded. Clara shook her head. "Someone has to hold them off. Get those documents to Marshal Wilson. Make it count." Gideon hesitated, torn. This brave woman was sacrificing herself for their escape, for her husband's justice. "Go," Clara repeated more forcefully. "Ranger's waiting for you at the stable. Take him with you." The decision was made for them as boots thundered down the main staircase. Clara positioned herself at the servants' stair, shotgun ready. "God go with you," she said, not looking back. Gideon and Singing Bird plunged into the tunnel, pulling the hidden door closed behind them. As they ran, the muffled sound of Clara's shotgun boomed twice more, followed by pistol fire. They emerged from the livery stable into chaos. What had started as Clara's distraction had evolved into a full-scale riot. The Golden Palace was ablaze, flames licking at the ornate facade despite the rain. Men fought in the muddy street, some in deputy uniforms, others in miners' clothes. A group of women saloon girls, by their dress, were systematically smashing bottles behind the palace's bar. What in God's name did she do? Gideon wondered aloud. Ranger materialized from the shadows, pressing against his leg briefly before leading them away from the mayhem. They skirted the edge of town, keeping to the darkness. As they reached the outskirts, a voice called out, "Hail! Stop where you are!" Colonel Blackwood stood 20 yards away, revolver leveled. His silver-trimmed hat was gone, his expensive coat torn, and blood trickled from a cut above his eye, apparently a casualty of the riot. "That's far enough," he said, advancing slowly. "Where's the Apache woman?" Gideon realized Singing Bird had melted into the shadows when Blackwood appeared. He kept his hands visible, drawing the colonel's attention. "She's gone, Blackwood, with the documents. They're probably halfway to Cedar Ridge by now." Blackwood's scarred face twisted in a sneer. "You're lying. She wouldn't leave you." He cocked his revolver. "No matter. Once you're dead, I'll find her easily enough." "You might find this first," came Singing Bird's voice from behind him. Blackwood started to turn, but too late. Singing Bird drove a heavy piece of wood into the back of his knee. He went down with a howl of pain, his revolver discharging harmlessly into the mud. Gideon kicked the weapon away, drawing his own revolver. "On your feet, Colonel." Blackwood rose unsteadily, hatred blazing in his eyes. "You have no idea what you're involved in, Hale. This goes beyond a few land deals. The governor, senators, even people in Washington, they all have interests here." "I'm sure Marshal Wilson will be fascinated to hear all about it," Gideon replied, gesturing with his revolver. "Start walking." "Where are you taking me?" "Back to my 12-cent cabin. I think it's time you met the Apache chief you had strung up there." Fear flickered across Blackwood's face. "Two Ravens is dead." "Yes, he is," Singing Bird confirmed coldly. "And you'll answer to his spirit before you answer to the law." They bound Blackwood's hands and set off into the night, Ranger leading the way. Behind them, Redemption continued to burn the flames visible for miles, a beacon of chaos in the darkness. Dawn broke clear and cold after the night's storm. Gideon, Singing Bird, and their prisoner had traveled through the night, following game trails to avoid the main roads where Blackwood's remaining men might be searching. The colonel had remained sullenly silent for most of the journey, but as they neared Whispering Creek, he grew increasingly agitated. "You're making a mistake, Hale," he said as they paused to rest the horses. "Let me go and I can make you rich. That silver mine the Apache woman told you about, it's real. Worth millions. I can give you a share." Gideon ignored him, checking the horse's hooves for stones. "Or perhaps it's not money you want," Blackwood continued. "Power, then. Governor Webb owes me. I could get you appointed as territorial marshal. A man with your background might appreciate a fresh start with a badge." This caught Gideon's attention. "What do you know about my background?" Blackwood smiled, seeing he'd struck a nerve. "More than you think, Deputy Hale. Or should I say former Deputy Hale of Dodge City, the man who shot Marshal Frank Tanner in what some called cold blood." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Tanner drew first. That's not how some tell it. They say you executed him for taking bribes, appointed yourself judge, jury, and executioner." Blackwood leaned forward. "Sound familiar? Isn't that exactly what you're doing with me?" Before Gideon could respond, Singing Bird approached from where she'd been scouting ahead. "Riders coming, 6 of them moving fast. Blackwood's men," she nodded, "heading toward the cabin. They'll cut us off if we continue on this trail." Gideon considered their options. They were still 2 miles from the cabin in rough country with limited cover. Their horses were tired, and they were outnumbered. "There's another way," Singing Bird said, gesturing toward a rocky ridge to their east. "Through Apache Pass. It's dangerous narrow trail along a cliff face, but it will bring us to the creek behind the cabin." "Can the horses make it?" "If we lead them carefully," Blackwood laughed. "Apache Pass! You'll break your necks. It's a death trap." "Then you'd better pray your balance is good, Colonel," Gideon replied, hauling the man to his feet. They set off toward the ridge, Singing Bird leading the way. As they climbed, the terrain grew increasingly treacherous, loose shale giving way underfoot, the trail narrowing until it was barely wide enough for a horse to pass. To their right rose a sheer rock wall. To their left, a drop of several hundred feet to jagged rocks below. "Keep moving," Gideon ordered Blackwood, who was struggling with his bound hands. "Cut me loose," the colonel demanded. "I can't navigate this with my hands tied." "You'll manage." They had traversed perhaps half the pass when disaster struck. Blackwood's horse, spooked by a falling rock, reared suddenly. The colonel, unable to control the animal with bound hands, was thrown from the saddle. He tumbled toward the edge, scrabbling desperately for purchase on the loose shale. Gideon lunged, catching Blackwood's coat just as he slid over the precipice. The colonel dangled from Gideon's grip, the long drop to the rocks below yawning beneath him. "Pull me up!" Blackwood gasped, terror replacing the arrogance in his eyes. Gideon strained his wounded leg, protesting, as he tried to haul the man back onto the trail. Singing Bird appeared beside him, reaching down to grasp Blackwood's arm. Together, they dragged the colonel back from the edge. He collapsed on the trail, breathing hard, actual gratitude in his eyes as he looked up at Gideon. "You saved me," he panted. "Why?" Gideon hauled him to his feet. "Because I'm not the cold-blooded killer you think I am, and because you're going to face justice for what you did, not an accidental death that lets your masters walk free." They continued along the pass more carefully now, finally emerging onto a gentler slope that led down to Whispering Creek. The cabin was visible in the distance, but so were the riders. Singing Bird had spotted Blackwood's men circling the property. "They're searching for something," Singing Bird observed. "The documents, most likely." "Let them search," Gideon said. "What we need isn't in the cabin anyway." He turned to Singing Bird. "You said there were 3 sets of documents, one at Judge Crane's office, which we have, one at the cabin, which they're looking for, and the third, 'Where blood and water meet,'" she quoted. "Samuel's riddle. And what does it mean?" Singing Bird pointed to a spot where Whispering Creek curved around a large boulder. "There. That's where our people were massacred 5 years ago. Their blood soaked into the creek bank. Samuel and I buried the lockbox beneath that boulder the night before he was killed." Blackwood's face showed surprise, then calculation. Gideon caught the look. "Don't get any ideas, Colonel. Your men won't find anything at the cabin. And even if they did, the documents we took from Crane's office are enough to hang you." "You'll never make it to Cedar Ridge alive," Blackwood replied, his composure returning. "My men are everywhere." "We'll take our chances." Gideon turned to Singing Bird. "We need those documents from the creek. Then we ride for Cedar Ridge non-stop." She nodded, determination in her eyes. "Together." As they prepared to descend toward the creek, a gunshot echoed across the valley. One of Blackwood's men had spotted them on the ridge. Shouts carried on the morning air as the riders wheeled their horses toward the trail leading up. "So much for the element of surprise," Gideon muttered, checking his Winchester. "Change of plans. We make for the creek, get the documents, then head straight east. No stopping for anything." "What about him?" Singing Bird nodded toward Blackwood. Gideon considered the colonel, who watched him with calculating eyes. "He comes with us. He's our insurance." They mounted quickly, Blackwood sharing Gideon's horse under protest. As they rode down toward Whispering Creek, the shouts of the pursuing men grew louder. The race for the final set of documents and for their lives had begun. The waters of Whispering Creek ran clear and cold, gurgling over smooth stones worn by centuries of passage. But 5 years ago, Singing Bird remembered this same creek had run red with Apache blood. She could still see the bodies, men, women, children, scattered along the banks like broken dolls, their blood seeping into the soil, into the water. Now she crouched beside the massive boulder that marked the massacre site, Gideon standing guard with his Winchester, while Blackwood sat nearby, hands bound, watching with calculating eyes. In the distance, the shouts of the colonel's men grew closer as they searched for a path down from the ridge. "We have minutes, not hours," Gideon warned, scanning the tree line. Singing Bird nodded, focusing on the task at hand. The boulder had shifted since she and Samuel had buried the lockbox, possibly from spring floods or natural settling. She dug frantically at its base, her fingers bleeding as they scraped against stone and hard-packed earth. It's here," she insisted. "It has to be here." "My men are coming," Blackwood said, a smirk playing at his lips despite his bound hands, "and they won't be as merciful as Hale here." Gideon ignored him, keeping his rifle trained on the approach to the creek. "Singing Bird, we need to move." "Wait." Her fingers struck something solid beneath the soil. "I found it." She excavated quickly, revealing a small metal box, rusted but intact. From around her neck, she pulled the brass key 2 ravens had entrusted to her. It turned in the lock with difficulty, the mechanism protesting after years underground. Inside lay a stack of documents, protected by oilskin land deeds, treaties, and most damning of all letters between Governor Webb, Judge Crane, and railroad executives discussing the Apache problem and how to circumvent federal treaties. "This is it," Singing Bird said quickly, securing the papers inside her jacket. "Everything Samuel and I collected. With these, and what we took from Crane's office, we have them." The crack of a rifle shot split the air. A bullet whined off the boulder inches from Gideon's head. "Down!" he shouted, pulling Singing Bird behind the rock as more shots followed. 3 riders had emerged from the trees, rifles raised. They were still at a distance, but closing fast. "Time to go," Gideon said, hauling Blackwood to his feet. "Move toward the horses. I'll cover you." Singing Bird grabbed the colonel's arm, dragging him toward where they'd left their mounts. Gideon fired 2 carefully placed shots, forcing the approaching riders to seek cover. They reached the horses as more of Blackwood's men appeared. Gideon helped Singing Bird mount, then shoved Blackwood roughly onto his own horse, swinging up behind him. "Head east," Gideon shouted, "toward Cedar Ridge." They spurred their horses, splashing across Whispering Creek and up the opposite bank. Bullets kicked up dirt around them as they rode, but distance and poor angles made for inaccurate shooting. As they crested a rise, Gideon glanced back. The riders had remounted and were in pursuit, but their horses seemed tired, perhaps from a long night searching for their leader. "We can outrun them," he called to Singing Bird. "If we push hard, we can reach Cedar Ridge by nightfall." Cedar Ridge lay 40 miles east, a hard day's ride under ideal conditions. With tired horses, a prisoner, and armed men in pursuit, it would be a punishing journey. Blackwood seated awkwardly in front of Gideon, twisted to look at him. "You're making a mistake, Hale. Those documents won't change anything. Webb has friends in Washington, powerful friends. This will all be buried." "Like the Apache at Whispering Creek," Gideon replied coldly. "Not this time." "You think you're different from me?" Blackwood laughed a harsh sound. "We're the same, you and I. Men who do what's necessary. The only difference is, I chose the winning side. We're nothing alike. No, you killed a man in Dodge City because you decided he deserved it. How many did you kill in the war? How many rebels died by your hand because some general pointed and said, them? Gideon tightened his grip on the reins. That was war. And this is progress. The Apache were in the way. The territory needs that silver, that railway. You can't stop what's coming, hail. The tide of civilization doesn't break for sentiment. Is that how you justify murder, by calling it progress? Blackwood shrugged. Call it what you want. In 50 years, no one will remember the Apache of Whispering Creek. But the silver mine, the railway, those will still be here. That's the only immortality that matters. Singing Bird, riding alongside, had heard enough. My people will be remembered, she said fiercely. And so will your crimes. They rode hard through the morning, pushing east across increasingly barren terrain. The Montana Badlands stretched before them, a harsh landscape of rock formations and scrub brush, baking under the summer sun. Water would soon become a concern. Their canteens were less than half full, and the next creek was hours away. By midday, the pursuit had fallen back, visible only as distant dust on the horizon. Gideon allowed a brief stop in the shadow of a sandstone outcropping, giving the horses a chance to rest. They're still following, Singing Bird observed, passing a canteen to Gideon. But falling behind. Their horses were already tired. He took a careful sip, then offered the water to Blackwood, who drank greedily. How far to Cedar Ridge? She asked. 25 miles, maybe 30. Rough country between here and there. Blackwood laughed. You'll never make it. There's no water for 20 miles. By nightfall, your horses will be done. And my men know this country better than you ever will. Gideon studied the colonel thoughtfully. You seem mighty confident for a man with his hands tied. I know what's coming. Blackwood nodded toward the eastern horizon where dark clouds were gathering. Summer storm, flash floods in the Badlands. You'll be forced to high ground, and that's where they'll be waiting. As if to punctuate his words, distant thunder rumbled across the plains. Singing Bird met Gideon's eyes. We should keep moving. Storm or not, Cedar Ridge is our only chance. They remounted, pushing their tired horses eastward. The air grew heavy with approaching rain, the sky darkening ominously. By mid-afternoon, fat drops began to fall, quickly intensifying to a downpour that turned the dusty ground to slick mud. Lightning cracked across the sky, followed by deafening thunder. The horses grew skittish, struggling to maintain footing on the increasingly treacherous terrain. We need shelter, Gideon shouted over the storm. There's a line shack near Cottonwood Draw. Used it years back when I was hunting bounty in these parts. Singing Bird nodded, rain plastering her hair to her face. They altered course slightly, heading toward a shallow valley where sparse cottonwoods suggested water. The line shack appeared suddenly through the curtain of rain, a crude one-room structure of logs and sod, long abandoned but still standing. They dismounted, leading the horses to a lean-to attached to one side. Inside the shack was dusty but dry, with a small stone fireplace and the remains of a wooden bunk. Gideon found kindling and a few logs stacked beside the hearth, miraculously still dry enough to burn. Soon, a small fire cast flickering light across the cabin's interior. Blackwood sat against one wall, his bound hands resting on his knees. Cozy, he remarked sarcastically. Just the place for my men to find us. Your men are miles back, fighting the same storm we are, Gideon replied, checking the cabin's single window. Outside, the rain had become a solid sheet, visibility reduced to mere yards. Singing Bird removed her soaked jacket, spreading it near the fire to dry. The documents from both the courthouse and the creek were wrapped securely in oilskin still protected, despite the downpour. "The storm is a blessing," she said. "It washes away our tracks and creates new problems," Gideon countered. "Blackwood's right about one thing: the Badlands flood. If this keeps up, the routes to Cedar Ridge will be underwater by morning." Then we waited out. With his men closing in, not much of a choice. Blackwood watched their exchange with evident satisfaction. "Quite the dilemma, isn't it? Push on and drown, or stay and be caught. I'd say your luck has run out. Hail." Gideon approached the colonel, crouching to eye level. "You seem awfully sure your men are still coming. Almost like you knew they'd be in position regardless of which way we ran. Good commanders plan for contingencies. Or like you've been leaving a trail." Before Blackwood could respond, Gideon grabbed the colonel's boots, pulling them off, despite the man's protests. He examined them carefully, then found what he suspected: a small metal object embedded in the left heel. "Thought so," Gideon said, holding up a silver disc the size of a $50. "Army Telegraph Corps used these during the war. Signal trackers. Reflects sunlight or firelight in a pattern visible for miles with the right equipment." Blackwood's expression confirmed the theory. "You've been signaling your men since we took you." Gideon continued, crushing the disc under his boot. "Every time we stopped, every time there was light." "Clever," Blackwood admitted. "But too late. They already know our general direction. This storm won't hold them forever." Gideon turned to Singing Bird. "We leave at first light, storm or no storm. For now, get some rest. I'll take first watch." She nodded, moving to the decrepit bunk, while Gideon positioned himself by the window Winchester across his lap. Blackwood remained seated against the wall, eyes closed, but alert. Outside, the storm continued to rage, lightning illuminating the Badlands in stark white flashes, thunder rolling across the plains like artillery fire. Gideon woke to silence. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a world transformed. Moonlight streamed through the cabin window, casting silver patterns across the dirt floor. He'd dozed off during his watch, a dangerous lapse. Quickly, he assessed the situation. Singing Bird still slept on the bunk, exhaustion having claimed her, despite the circumstances. But Blackwood... The colonel sat exactly where he'd been, eyes open, watching Gideon with an unsettling intensity. "You could have escaped," Gideon said quietly, not wanting to wake Singing Bird. "With my hands bound in a storm. I'm not a fool, Hale." "Then what are you looking at?" "A man who doesn't know himself." Blackwood leaned forward slightly. "You think you're righteous, but we both know that's a lie. Men like us, we understand power. How to take it, how to use it. I'm nothing like you." "No. Then why are we having this conversation while the Apache woman sleeps? Why not wake her?" "Because you're considering my offer from before. The silver mine. The position. A fresh start." Gideon's jaw tightened. "You're wrong." "Am I? I saw how you looked at those documents, not with triumph, but with doubt. You're smart enough to know that even if you reach Cedar Ridge, even if Marshal Wilson believes you, nothing changes. The Apache are still gone. The silver still gets mined. The only difference is whether you profit from it or die fighting it." Outside, an owl hooted 3 times in succession. Blackwood smiled. "My men," he said softly. "Right on schedule." Gideon was on his feet, instantly moving to the window. In the moonlight, he could make out shapes moving among the cottonwoods, at least 4 men approaching cautiously. "Singing Bird," he called, keeping his voice low but urgent. "Wake up. They're here." She rose quickly, instantly alert. "How many?" "4 that I can see. Probably more hanging back." Blackwood laughed softly. Give up now, Hale. You're outnumbered, outgunned. There's still a way out for you. Not for her, of course, but for you. Gideon ignored him, mind racing through options. The cabin had only one door and one window. The horses were outside in the lean-to, likely already discovered by Blackwood's men. They were trapped. The fireplace, Singing Bird said suddenly. These line shacks often have escape tunnels. Mountain lions, bears, the hunters needed a way out if something came through the door. She moved to the stone fireplace, feeling along its base. Here, she whispered, finding a loose stone. She pulled it free, then another, revealing a narrow opening barely large enough for a man to squeeze through. It leads under the back wall, she explained. Samuel showed me one like it once. Gideon nodded, impressed. You go first with the documents. I'll be right behind you. What about him? She gestured toward Blackwood. Leave him. His men will find him soon enough. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. You do that, and I'll tell them exactly which way you went. They'll run you down before dawn. Then what do you suggest, Colonel, we take you with us? Use you as a shield. Cut me loose, Blackwood said. Let me walk out that door. I'll tell my men you escaped hours ago, headed west toward Liberty. It'll give you time to reach Cedar Ridge. Gideon laughed incredulously. And why would you do that? Because you saved my life on Apache Pass. I pay my debts, Hale, even to enemies. Singing Bird shook her head. Don't trust him. He'll betray us the moment he's free. Before Gideon could respond, a voice called from outside, Colonel Blackwood, are you in there? Make your decision, Blackwood hissed. Now. Gideon hesitated, weighing impossible options. Then, to Singing Bird's evident shock, he drew his knife and cut Blackwood's bonds. You're a fool, Hale, she whispered fiercely. Maybe, he agreed, but we need time more than we need him. He turned to Blackwood. A life for a life, Colonel. That's the deal. Blackwood rubbed his wrists, smiling thinly. Indeed. Colonel, the voice outside called again, closer now. Go, Gideon told Singing Bird, guiding her toward the fireplace tunnel. I'll be right behind you. She hesitated, then squeezed through the narrow opening, clutching the precious documents to her chest. Gideon moved to follow, pausing to look back at Blackwood. Remember your debt, he said. Blackwood's smile widened. Oh, I always pay what I owe, Hale, one way or another. Gideon slipped into the tunnel just as the cabin door burst open. Through the stone gap, he saw Boots enter Blackwood's men, weapons drawn. Then the colonel's voice, calm and commanding. Stand down, gentlemen. Our friends have fled west toward Liberty. They left hours ago thinking the storm would cover their tracks. But, sir, a voice protested, we found their horses outside. Decoys, Blackwood replied smoothly. They took my horse when they left. Now get fresh mounts. We ride west immediately. Gideon didn't wait to hear more. He crawled through the narrow earthen tunnel, emerging behind the cabin where Singing Bird waited in the shadows. Together they moved silently toward the cottonwoods, keeping low. He actually did it, Singing Bird whispered, disbelief evident in her voice. For now, Gideon replied, but we can't count on his debt lasting long. We need to move while we can. They worked their way through the trees until they reached the edge of a wash, normally dry, but now flowing with runoff from the storm. The muddy water rushed past, carrying debris from upstream. No horses, Singing Bird said, looking back toward the cabin where lanterns now glowed and men's voices carried on the night air. How far to Cedar Ridge on foot? 15 miles, maybe more. Rough country, especially after the storm. Gideon studied the wash. But this can work to our advantage. Water leaves no tracks. They waded into the chilly flow, letting it carry them downstream away from the cabin. The water was knee-deep in most places, swift but manageable. After nearly a mile, they climbed out on the opposite bank, continuing east on foot. The night was clear after the storm stars blazing overhead in the vast Montana sky. They made good time across the muddy terrain, Gideon setting a punishing pace despite his bad leg. By the time false dawn lightened the eastern horizon, they had covered several miles. They paused on a rise, looking back the way they'd come. No sign of pursuit. "Maybe he actually kept his word," Singing Bird said, though her tone suggested she didn't believe it. "Maybe." Gideon wasn't convinced either. "But we keep moving. Cedar Ridge is still a long way off." As the sun rose, the landscape revealed itself in harsh detail, a maze of eroded gullies, dry washes, and rocky outcroppings. The storm had altered the terrain, carving new channels and washing away familiar landmarks. Navigation would be challenging, especially without horses. They descended into a broad ravine, following what appeared to be an old game trail. The ground was still soft from the rain, making for difficult walking. By midday, exhaustion began to take its toll, their pace slowing despite the urgency of their mission. "We need to rest," Singing Bird said finally, her voice hoarse with thirst. Their canteens were nearly empty, the water from Whispering Creek now a distant memory. Gideon nodded reluctantly, guiding them to a small overhang that offered some shade from the relentless sun. They sat in silence for a time, conserving energy and what little water remained. "What Blackwood said back there," Singing Bird began hesitantly, "about you considering his offer. Was that true?" Gideon didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "A man thinks about many things when his back's against the wall." "That's not an answer." "No, it's not." He turned to face her. "I won't lie to you, Singing Bird. For a moment, just a moment, I wondered what it would be like to stop running, to take the easy path. The path of the men who massacred my people." "Yes." His honesty was brutal but necessary. "I've been running for 10 years. From Sarah's grave. From what I did in Dodge City. From myself. Part of me is tired of running. And now," he met her eyes directly, "now I know there's only one direction worth moving. Forward. With you. With the truth." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied with what she saw. "Then we should keep moving. Cedar Ridge is still far." They continued their journey through the afternoon, the terrain growing more difficult as they entered a region locals called the Maze, a labyrinth of narrow canyons and towering rock formations. It was slow going with frequent backtracks when passages proved impassable. "We're losing time," Gideon said as the sun began its westward descent. "At this rate, we won't reach Cedar Ridge until tomorrow afternoon." "If we reach it at all," Singing Bird added grimly. Their water was gone now, and both were feeling the effects of dehydration after the long trek. They rounded a bend in the canyon and stopped abruptly. Ahead, the passage widened into a small clearing where 4 horsemen waited, rifles ready. Blackwood's men. "Well, well," said the lead rider, a hard-faced man with a drooping mustache. "Look what we found, boys. The colonel said you'd be coming this way." Gideon's hand moved toward his revolver but froze as 4 rifles leveled at his chest. "I wouldn't," the leader warned. "Colonel Blackwood wants you alive, but he didn't specify in what condition." "Blackwood lied to you," Gideon said, playing for time. "He told us he was sending you west." The man laughed. "The colonel tells us lots of things, but he pays us to think for ourselves. When we found those wet tracks leading east from the cabin well, simple deduction. Singing Bird tensed beside Gideon, her hand slipping inside her jacket where the documents were hidden. "The woman," the leader continued, "she can live if she hands over the papers, Colonel's orders." "And him?" she asked, nodding toward Gideon. The man's smile was cold. "The Colonel has special plans for Mr. Hale. Something about a debt that needs paying." Gideon and Singing Bird exchanged glances. They were trapped outgunned with no apparent escape. The documents were all that mattered now, getting them to Cedar Ridge, to Marshal Wilson, to justice. "All right," Singing Bird said slowly, reaching into her jacket. "I'll give you the papers." "Singing Bird," Gideon began, but she silenced him with a look. She withdrew a bundle wrapped in oilskin, holding it up for the men to see. "Here they are, all of them. The treaties, the letters, everything." The leader gestured with his rifle. "Toss them over." Instead, Singing Bird threw the bundle high into the air. As all eyes followed its arc, Gideon drew and fired in one smooth motion, hitting the leader square in the chest. He toppled from his horse as the other men scrambled to respond. Singing Bird dove for cover behind a boulder, drawing a small derringer from her boot, a weapon Clara Hayes had given her back in redemption. She fired twice, hitting one man in the shoulder. Gideon rolled behind a rock outcropping as bullets chipped stone around him. He returned fire, carefully making each shot count. One more rider fell, then another was wounded, clutching his leg. The last man standing threw down his rifle. "Don't shoot! I surrender." Silence fell across the clearing, broken only by the moans of the wounded. Singing Bird emerged cautiously, retrieving the bundle she'd thrown a decoy filled with blank paper wrapped in oilskin. The real documents remained secure inside her jacket. "Get on your horse," Gideon told the surrendering man. "Take your wounded and ride back to Blackwood. Tell him his debt is now paid in full." The man nodded frantically, helping his injured companions mount. They rode off the way they'd come, leaving their dead behind. "That was quick thinking," Gideon said to Singing Bird. "The decoy." "Clara's idea," she replied. "She prepared it back in redemption just in case." She patted her jacket where the real documents rested. "These never leave my side until they're in Marshal Wilson's hands." Gideon checked the fallen men's canteens, finding two still half full. "At least we won't die of thirst now." He handed one to Singing Bird. "And we have horses." They mounted the abandoned horses, continuing their journey with renewed urgency. The encounter had cost them valuable time, and now Blackwood would know exactly where they were headed. As they rode, a new worry gnawed at Gideon. Blackwood had anticipated their route too precisely. Even accounting for logical deduction, the ambush felt planned, as if the Colonel had known exactly which path they would take through the maze. How did they know? He wondered aloud as they pushed through a narrow canyon. This route isn't obvious, even to someone who knows the territory. Singing Bird's expression darkened. "There's only one explanation. Blackwood knew because I knew." "What do you mean?" "This path through the maze, it's an old Apache trail. Few white men know of it. I told my father about it when we separated after Whispering Creek." "You think two ravens told Blackwood under torture?" She nodded grimly. "It would explain how they found us so easily. My father would have resisted as long as possible, but even the strongest break, eventually." The implication hung between them unspoken, but clear. If Blackwood knew this route from Two Ravens, what else might he know? What other traps might lie ahead? They pushed on through the afternoon and into evening, the terrain gradually flattening as they emerged from the maze onto the high plains. Cedar Ridge was visible in the distance, a dark line on the horizon still hours away. As night fell, they made camp in a shallow depression that offered some protection from both the elements and prying eyes. They had no fire, unwilling to risk its light being spotted by pursuing riders. "We'll reach Cedar Ridge by mid-morning," Gideon said, studying the stars to confirm their direction. "Marshal Wilson's office is on the main street, can't miss it." Singing Bird sat with her back against a rock, the documents spread across her lap. She'd been reviewing them by moonlight, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "What is it?" Gideon asked. "These letters," she said, holding up several pages. "Between Governor Webb and someone in Washington, a Senator Hollister. They discuss more than just the silver mine or the railroad." "What else?" "A military campaign. Systematic removal of all Apache, Crow, and Blackfoot from the territory. Not just land theft, extermination." Her voice hardened. Whispering Creek was a test, a proof of concept. Gideon took the letters, reading them carefully. The language was couched in bureaucratic terms, but the meaning was clear enough. This goes higher than Webb or Crane, all the way to Washington. Yes, and that's why Blackwood is so desperate to stop us. These documents don't just implicate him or the local officials. They implicate the federal government in planned genocide. The weight of this revelation settled over them. What they carried wasn't just evidence of local corruption or land fraud, it was proof of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. A conspiracy that, if exposed, could bring down not just Blackwood and Webb, but senators, cabinet members, perhaps even the president himself. "No wonder they're hunting us so hard," Gideon said quietly. "This is bigger than either of us imagined." "And more dangerous," Singing Bird added. "Marshal Wilson may be honest, but can we be sure he'll stand against his own government? We don't have much choice at this point. We need allies, and Wilson is the closest thing we have." They fell silent, each contemplating the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. The night grew colder, stars wheeling overhead in their eternal dance. "Get some sleep," Gideon finally said. "I'll take first watch." Singing Bird nodded carefully, returning the documents to their oilskin wrapping. She hesitated, then reached out to touch Gideon's hand. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything, for believing in this, in me." "I believe in the truth," he replied. "It's about time I started facing it instead of running from it." She smiled slightly, then curled up on her side, using her saddle as a pillow. Within minutes, her breathing deepened into sleep. Gideon sat with his Winchester across his knees, watching the dark horizon. The burden of what they carried felt heavier than ever. This wasn't just about justice for two ravens or the other Apache massacred at Whispering Creek. It wasn't even about his 12-cent cabin anymore. This was about the soul of a nation, about whether America would face its sins or bury them beneath progress and prosperity. As midnight approached, a flicker of movement caught Gideon's eye. A distant light, then another moving across the plains toward their position. Lanterns, riders, at least a dozen, maybe more. Too many to be just Blackwood's men. This was a larger force moving with purpose and precision. Cavalry. Gideon shook Singing Bird awake. "We've got company," he said urgently. "Soldiers coming this way." She rose instantly, gathering the documents. "How many?" "A full troop by the look of it. We need to move now." They saddled their horses quickly, mounting in the darkness. The approaching lights were closer now, spread out in a search pattern that would be difficult to evade on the open plain. "They must have telegraphed ahead to Fort Kearny," Singing Bird said. "Called in the cavalry. Which means Blackwood's influence reaches further than we thought." Gideon studied the terrain, looking for options. "We can't outrun them, not in the dark, on unfamiliar ground." "Then what?" He pointed toward Cedar Ridge, still hours away. "We split up. You take the documents, make for the ridge using that dry creek bed. I'll head west, draw them after me." "No," she protested. "We stay together. One of us needs to get those papers to Wilson. You know what they contain, what they mean. It has to be you." The lanterns were close enough now that they could hear the jingle of tack and the muffled commands of officers. They had minutes, not hours. Singing Bird's face was a mask of conflicted emotions. "And you, what happens to you if they catch you?" "I'll be fine," Gideon lied, forcing a confidence he didn't feel. "Just another saddle tramp they'll question and release. But if they catch you with those documents—" She knew he was right. The evidence she carried was too important to risk. "Cedar Ridge," she said. "Marshal Wilson's office. I'll wait for you there." "2 days," Gideon replied. "If I'm not there in 2 days, get those papers to someone who can use them. A newspaper editor in St. Louis or Chicago. Someone beyond Webb's reach." She nodded, then surprised him by leaning forward and pressing her lips briefly to his. "2 days," she repeated. "Not a moment longer." Before he could respond, she wheeled her horse toward the creek bed and was gone, melting into the darkness like a shadow. Gideon watched her go, then turned his mount westward. He removed his hat, waving it above his head, as he spurred the horse into a gallop. "Over here!" he shouted deliberately, drawing attention. "This way!" The lanterns changed direction, immediately converging on his position. He raced across the plain, leading them away from Singing Bird's escape route. A voice called out behind him, "Halt! In the name of the United States Army!" Gideon ignored the command, pushing his horse harder. A rifle cracked in the darkness, the bullet whizzing past his ear. More shots followed, but he kept riding, determined to give Singing Bird as much time as possible. His horse faltered, stumbling on the uneven ground. Before Gideon could correct, the animal went down, throwing him clear. He hit the ground hard, pain exploding in his already damaged leg. By the time he regained his senses, he was surrounded by mounted soldiers' rifles aimed at his chest. A lieutenant dismounted, approaching with lantern held high. "Gideon Hale?" the officer asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Who wants to know?" Gideon replied, struggling to his feet despite the pain. "Lieutenant James Hollister, 7th Cavalry. You're under arrest for the murder of Sheriff Miller, of redemption theft, of government property, and treason against the United States." Hollister, the same name as the senator in the letters Singing Bird had found. Not a coincidence, Gideon was certain. "Treason?" he asked, playing for time. "That's a serious charge, Lieutenant." "Where is the Apache woman?" Hollister demanded, ignoring Gideon's comment. "And the documents you stole?" "Don't know what you're talking about," Gideon replied. "I'm just a rancher heading to Cedar Ridge to sell some cattle." The lieutenant's face hardened. Without any cattle in the middle of the night, he gestured to his men. "Search him." Rough hands patted Gideon down, finding nothing of interest except his weapons, which were confiscated. "Where is she?" Hollister repeated, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Who?" The lieutenant's response was a backhanded blow that split Gideon's lip. "Don't play games, Hale. Colonel Blackwood has told us everything. The documents you stole contain sensitive military information. Their release would endanger American lives." "Is that what he told you?" Gideon wiped blood from his mouth. "Did he also tell you about the massacre at Whispering Creek? About the forged land treaties? About murdering Samuel Hartwell and 2 ravens?" Uncertainty flickered across Hollister's face, quickly replaced by military discipline. "That's not my concern. My orders are to retrieve the documents and apprehend both you and the Apache woman." "Orders from your father, Senator Hollister." The lieutenant's eyes widened slightly, a tell that confirmed Gideon's suspicion. "Bind his hands," Hollister ordered, turning away. We ride for Fort Kearny immediately." As soldiers secured his wrists with rope, Gideon glanced eastward toward Cedar Ridge. Singing Bird was long gone, hopefully well on her way to safety. If she could reach Marshal Wilson, there was still a chance for justice. But, as he was roughly hoisted onto a spare horse, Gideon couldn't shake a growing sense of dread. The involvement of the army changed everything. This was no longer a local matter that could be resolved by a territorial marshal. The conspiracy reached all the way to Washington, to the halls of Congress. And if Senator Hollister was willing to deploy cavalry to recover those documents, what else might he do to protect himself and his co-conspirators? As the troop turned toward Fort Kearny, Gideon could only hope that Singing Bird would be more cautious than he had been. The truth she carried was more dangerous than either of them had imagined. And somewhere out there, Colonel Blackwood was still hunting a predator who never forgot a debt, or those who crossed him. Fort Kearny stood on a bluff overlooking the Missouri River, its weathered stockade walls and parade ground speaking to decades of frontier duty. Originally built to protect settlers heading west, it now served as headquarters for the 7th Cavalry, the same unit that had carried out the massacre at Whispering Creek 5 years earlier. Gideon Hale sat in a cell beneath the fort's guardhouse, his wrists raw from rope burns, his injured leg throbbing mercilessly. The room was 8 feet square, windowless, with only a rough wooden bench for furniture. A single lantern hanging outside the iron-barred door cast meager light into the space. He'd been there for nearly 24 hours by his estimation. No food, minimal water, and no word on what was to come. Classic tactics, isolation, disorientation, weakening the prisoner before interrogation. He'd seen it during the war. The cell door creaked open. Lieutenant Hollister entered, accompanied by 2 soldiers. The young officer looked fresher than he had on the plains, his uniform crisp, his manner coldly professional. "Mr. Hale," he began, standing at parade rest, "I trust you've had time to reconsider your position." Gideon didn't respond, studying the lieutenant's face instead. The family resemblance to the senator mentioned in the documents was clear, same sharp chin, same calculating eyes. "Your silence won't help you," Hollister continued. "We know you conspired with the Apache woman to steal classified government documents. We know you murdered Sheriff Miller in redemption. The only question remaining is whether you'll hang quickly or slowly." "Interesting charges," Gideon finally replied, his voice rough from thirst. "Especially since I've never met Sheriff Miller. Hard to murder a man you've never met. We have witnesses. I'm sure you do. Same witnesses who'll swear there was no massacre at Whispering Creek, that 2 ravens wasn't tortured and hanged from my cabin gate." Hollister's jaw tightened. "You're in no position to make accusations. Neither are you, Lieutenant. Not if you knew what was in those documents your father is so desperate to recover." The reference to his father hit home. Hollister's composure cracked just for a moment. "My father is a United States Senator serving his country," he said stiffly. "Your slander is treason." "Is that what he told you, that I'm a traitor?" Gideon leaned forward. "Ask yourself, Lieutenant, why would a senator send cavalry after an old soldier and an Apache woman? What documents could be so important?" "That's not my concern. My orders." "Orders," Gideon interrupted, contempt in his voice. "I followed orders once, at Gettysburg, Antietam. Followed them right into a field of dead boys in blue and gray. But there are some orders a man shouldn't follow, Lieutenant. Some things he shouldn't be part of, no matter whose name is on the paper." Hollister studied him for a long moment. "You sound like a man trying to save his own neck." "My neck's already in the noose. Has been since I paid 12 cents for that cabin. I'm just wondering if you know what you're really part of here." Before Hollister could respond, The door opened again. Colonel Blackwood entered resplendent in a freshly pressed uniform with cavalry insignia. The scar on his face seemed to stand out more prominently in the dim light, giving him a menacing appearance despite his polished exterior. "That will be all, Lieutenant," he said, dismissing Hollister with a casual wave. "I'll handle the prisoner from here." Hollister saluted crisply. "Sir, my orders were to personally interrogate." "Your orders have changed." Blackwood cut him off. "The senator has telegraphed new instructions. I'm to handle Hale personally." The lieutenant hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." He exited with his men closing the door behind them. Blackwood and Gideon were alone. "Well, well," the colonel said, smiling thinly. "How the mighty have fallen. The righteous Gideon, Hale defender of Apache widows and champion of lost causes, reduced to this." He gestured around the dismal cell. "Still better company than yours, Blackwood." The colonel chuckled. "Still defiant. I admire that in a way. Futile, but admirable." He pulled a silver flask from his jacket, taking a leisurely sip. "You know why I'm here, of course. To gloat. To negotiate." Blackwood sat on the edge of the bench. "Contrary to what young Hollister believes, your neck isn't necessarily in a noose. Not yet. Kind of you to clarify. I'm a reasonable man, Hale. Despite our differences, I recognize talent when I see it. You've survived longer than most who've crossed me. If this is another offer to join you, save your breath." "Not exactly." Blackwood leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I want the Apache woman singing bird. I want those documents. You're going to tell me where she's headed. And why would I do that? Because I'm offering you your life, and more importantly," he paused for effect, "I'm offering you the truth about Dodge City." Gideon stilled. "What do you know about Dodge?" "I know Marshal Frank Tanner didn't draw first. I know you shot him in cold blood. And I know why." Blackwood's smile widened at Gideon's surprise. "Oh, yes. I've done my research on you, Hale. Very thorough research." "You're bluffing." "Am I Sarah Tanner? That was your wife's maiden name, wasn't it, Frank's younger sister? She wrote to him when the fever hit your farm. He never responded. Never sent the money she begged for to buy medicine for your son." The cell seemed to close in around Gideon. No one knew this, no one still living. He'd never told anyone about Sarah's desperate letters to her brother or Frank's callous refusal to help his own flesh and blood. "How?" he managed. "Frank Tanner was my brother-in-law," Blackwood said simply. "My late wife's brother, family gossip, you might say. He boasted about it once drunk, how he'd taught his bleeding heart sister a lesson by ignoring her pleas, how she'd married beneath her choosing a dirt farmer turned soldier." Gideon's hands clenched into fists. "Your wife, Eleanor, she died 2 years ago. Consumption." For the first time, genuine emotion flashed across Blackwood's face, grief quickly masked. "She never knew what her brother had done. I kept it from her. And now you're using it as leverage." "I'm a practical man. We all have our secrets, Hale. Our buried sins." Blackwood stood. "Tell me where Singing Bird is taking those documents, and I'll ensure your revenge against Frank Tanner remains your secret. I'll even see that you're released with enough money to start fresh elsewhere. And if I refuse, then Lieutenant Hollister and his superiors will receive a detailed account of how you hunted down and executed Frank Tanner in a personal vendetta, how you admitted as much to me in this cell. Premeditated murder, Hale. That's a hanging offense in any territory." Gideon leaned back against the cold stone wall, mind racing. Blackwood knew his deepest secret, the real reason he'd confronted Marshal Tanner. Not corruption, though Tanner had been corrupt. Not justice, though justice had been served. Vengeance, pure and simple. For Sarah, for Thomas, for the lives that might have been saved if Frank Tanner had sent the money his dying sister had begged for. "You're quiet," Blackwood observed. "Considering your options, there aren't many." "There's always another option," Gideon replied. "The truth." Blackwood's eyebrows rose. "Confession, that's your play. They'll hang you by sunset." "Maybe, but Singing Bird will still have those documents. And sooner or later someone will listen to her. The truth has a way of coming out, Colonel, no matter how deep you try to bury it." For the first time, uncertainty crossed Blackwood's face. "You'd die to protect some Apache woman, some papers that no one will believe for what principal honor. Those are luxuries for men who've never had to make real choices." "No," Gideon said quietly. "I'd die because it's the right thing to do. Something you wouldn't understand." Blackwood studied him for a long moment, then laughed a sound devoid of humor. "Noble to the end, just like Samuel Hartwell. He made grand speeches, too, right before we strung him up." He moved to the door. "Think about my offer, Hale. I'll be back tomorrow for your answer. Though I suspect young Hollister's methods might change your perspective before then." With that ominous prediction, Blackwood left the cell door clanging shut behind him. Alone again, Gideon closed his eyes, trying to focus through pain and exhaustion. Blackwood's revelation about Frank Tanner had shaken him more than he cared to admit. The past he'd tried to outrun for so long had finally caught up to him. But more urgent than his own fate was Singing Bird's safety. Had she reached Cedar Ridge, found Marshal Wilson, or had Blackwood's men or worse other cavalry units intercepted her? Outside his cell boots approached multiple sets moving with purpose. The door swung open to reveal Lieutenant Hollister flanked by 4 soldiers. "On your feet, Hale," Hollister ordered. "Colonel Blackwood's been recalled to Washington. In his absence, I'm resuming command of your interrogation." The cold determination in the young officer's eyes left little doubt about what that entailed. Cedar Ridge had once been a mining boom town, but like many such settlements, its fortunes had faded when the ore played out. Now it survived as a trading post and way station for the stagecoach line that connected the more prosperous towns of the territory. Singing Bird entered cautiously as dawn broke her horse exhausted from the night's hard ride. The town consisted of a single main street lined with false-fronted buildings, most showing signs of neglect. A few early risers moved along the boardwalks, shopkeepers opening for the day, a drunk being ejected from a saloon that had never closed. The marshal's office sat at the far end of the street, a modest clapboard building with a sign proclaiming U.S. Marshal in faded letters. Singing Bird dismounted before reaching it, approaching on foot to avoid drawing attention. She paused outside, peering through the window. A single desk was visible unoccupied. No sign of Marshal Wilson or any deputies. The door was unlocked. She entered cautiously, finding the office empty. A pot of coffee sat on a small stove still warm. Whoever had been here had left recently. "Can I help you, miss?" She turned to find an elderly man in the doorway leading to a back room. He wore a faded cavalry uniform from an earlier era. His white hair and beard neatly trimmed his back, still military straight, despite his years. "I'm looking for Marshal Wilson," Singing Bird said, her hand instinctively moving to where the documents were hidden inside her jacket. "Marshal Wilson's been called to Liberty on urgent business," the old man replied. "I'm Deputy Marshal Ezekiel Jones, retired Captain 2nd Cavalry." He studied her with sharp blue eyes. You must be the Apache woman Colonel Blackwood's men are looking for." Her hand moved to the derringer concealed in her boot. "And if I am," Jones smiled slightly. "No need for that, miss. If I meant you harm, you'd already be in irons." He closed the door behind him. "Robert Hayes sent word before he died. Said there might be trouble coming. Something about land treaties and massacred Apache." Singing Bird relaxed marginally. "You knew Marshal Hayes. Served with his father in the Mexican War. Robert was a good man, an honest lawman." Jones poured 2 cups of coffee, offering one to Singing Bird. "His widow telegraphed yesterday. Said to expect you and a man named Hale." She accepted the coffee, warming her hands on the cup. "Gideon was captured. Cavalry under a Lieutenant Hollister." Jones frowned. "James Hollister, Senator's son?" "The same. They're holding him at Fort Kearny." "That's bad business. The senator's got the governor and half of Washington in his pocket." Jones gestured to a chair. "Sit, miss. You look dead on your feet." Singing Bird sat, gratitude for the moment's respite warring with urgency. "The documents we recovered, they prove everything. The forged treaties, the planned campaign against the tribes, even the senator's involvement. May I see them?" She hesitated, then withdrew the oilskin package from inside her jacket, placing it on the desk. Jones opened it carefully, examining the contents with a practiced eye. This is dynamite," he murmured, scanning a letter bearing the territorial governor's seal. "Enough to bring down Webb Crane, and even reach the senator." He looked up at Singing Bird. "No wonder they're hunting you so hard. Can you get them to Marshal Wilson? He needs to take them to the federal authorities in St. Louis." Jones refolded the documents thoughtfully. "Wilson won't be back for at least 3 days. And with the cavalry looking for you, staying here isn't safe." He seemed to reach a decision. "There's a place outside town, an old line shack on my property. You can hide there while I send word to Wilson." Singing Bird studied the old soldier, weighing his sincerity against the risk of trust. "How do I know I can trust you?" "You don't," Jones admitted frankly. "But Robert Hayes did, and that ought to count for something." After a moment's consideration, she nodded. "And Gideon, what about him? Fort Kearny's a hard nut to crack, military jurisdiction, but I've still got friends in the cavalry. Let me see what I can find out." Jones wrapped the documents carefully. "For now, these should go in the safe. Wilson's got the only other key, so they'll be secure until he returns." He moved to a painting of President Lincoln, swinging it aside to reveal a wall safe. As he began working the combination, Singing Bird noticed something odd: a silver-trimmed hat hanging on a hook by the door. One she'd seen before. Blackwood's hat. Understanding came too late. As Jones opened the safe, the back door burst open. 2 men entered, revolvers drawn. Behind them came Colonel James Blackwood himself, a triumphant smile on his scarred face. "Well done, Captain," he said to Jones. "I knew you would earn your payment." Jones wouldn't meet Singing Bird's accusing gaze. "You promised she wouldn't be harmed," he said to Blackwood, "and I keep my promises, usually." Blackwood took the documents from Jones's unresisting hands. "Miss Singing Bird will be treated with all the respect due a valuable prisoner." "You betrayed Hayes," Singing Bird said to Jones, contempt in her voice. "You betrayed everything he stood for." The old man's shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry, miss, truly, but a man on a captain's pension can't afford principles. Not in these times." Blackwood gestured to his men. "Secure her. Gently, mind you. The lady has had a trying journey." As the men approached, Singing Bird tensed, calculating odds, seeking an opening. There was none. She allowed herself to be disarmed, her wrists bound with surprising care. "Where is Gideon?" she demanded, as Blackwood examined the documents with obvious satisfaction. "Mr. Hale is enjoying the hospitality of Fort Kearny," the colonel replied, not looking up, though enjoying might be an overstatement. Lieutenant Hollister is rather enthusiastic in his interrogation methods. "If you've harmed him, you'll what?" Blackwood looked up, amused. "Your threats are as empty as your cause, my dear. The Apache had their time. Progress demands they step aside like so many before them." He tucked the documents into his coat. "History is written by the victors, and I assure you, we are the victors in this particular story." Jones cleared his throat uncomfortably. "What happens now?" "Now?" Blackwood considered. "Now Miss Singing Bird will accompany us back to Fort Kearny, where she'll be reunited with her champion, Mr. Hale. After that," he shrugged, "history will record that they both died attempting to escape, I imagine. Tragic, but not uncommon on the frontier." "That wasn't our agreement," Jones protested weakly. "Our agreement has been modified," Blackwood replied coldly. "I suggest you accept the new terms, Captain, unless you'd prefer to join them." Jones backed down, shame evident in his stooped posture. Singing Bird was led outside to where horses waited. Cedar Ridge was coming fully awake now, townspeople moving about their business. A few glanced curiously at the Apache woman being escorted by armed men, but no one intervened. No one ever did. As Blackwood helped her mount, she spoke quietly for his ears alone. "You won't win, Colonel. The truth doesn't die with us." "The truth," Blackwood replied equally soft, "is whatever those with power say it is. A lesson your people have never learned." He patted her horse's flank. "But take heart, you'll see your Mr. Hale soon. What's left of him, at least." With that chilling promise, they rode out of Cedar Ridge, heading west toward Fort Kearny. Behind them, Deputy Marshal Jones watched from the doorway of his office, the weight of his betrayal visible in his aged face. As they rode, Singing Bird's thoughts turned to Gideon. She had failed him, failed her father, failed her people. The documents that might have brought justice were now back in the hands of those who had orchestrated the massacre at Whispering Creek. Yet, deep inside, a small flame of defiance still burned. Her father had taught her that as long as one Apache lived, to remember the tribe was not truly dead. And she remembered everything, every name, every fact, every detail of the conspiracy. If there was even the slightest chance to get word out, she would take it. For 2 ravens, for Samuel Hartwell, for Gideon Hale and his 12-cent cabin, for truth. Lieutenant Hollister's interrogation had left Gideon drifting in and out of consciousness. His ribs ached from repeated blows, and dried blood caked his face from a split eyebrow. They'd been methodical professional damaging, without killing, hurting, without permanently disabling. He'd told them nothing. Not because he was particularly brave, but because betraying Singing Bird was unthinkable. She carried not just documents, but hope that the truth about Whispering Creek would finally be known, that the lives lost there would not be forgotten. The cell door opened. Through swollen eyes, Gideon saw Lieutenant Hollister enter, followed by a medic who carried a basin of water and bandages. "Clean him up," Hollister ordered the medic. "Colonel Blackwood will be returning shortly. He wants the prisoner presentable." As the medic worked, Hollister paced the small cell. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met, Hale, or the most foolish." He stopped studying Gideon with something like reluctant respect. "Most men break after the first hour." Gideon coughed, tasting copper. Not my first interrogation, Lieutenant. No, I suppose not. Hollister seemed troubled, his earlier certainty less evident. The colonel telegraphed. He's found your Apache woman. They'll be here by nightfall. Gideon's heart sank. Singing bird captured. The documents recovered. All for nothing. I've been reading some of your war record, Hollister continued almost conversationally. Distinguished service at Antietam. Commendation for bravery at Gettysburg. Not the profile of a traitor. Depends on what you're betraying, Gideon managed. Country or conscience, the lieutenant frowned. They're one and the same for a soldier. They should be, but sometimes they're not. Gideon winced as the medic cleaned a particularly deep cut. Sometimes a man has to choose, like you did in Dodge City with Marshal Tanner. So Blackwood had shared that information. That was different. Was it? From what the colonel told me, you appointed yourself judge and executioner then, too. Tanner was my wife's brother, Gideon said quietly. He let her and my son die when he could have helped, then bragged about it. Hollister's expression showed surprise. The colonel didn't mention that part. I'm sure he left out a lot of parts, like what really happened at Whispering Creek, like the forged treaties, like your father's letters to Governor Webb planning the removal of the Apache. The lieutenant stiffened. My father is a patriot. Patriots don't plan massacres of women and children. Gideon met Hollister's gaze directly. Ask Colonel Blackwood about the bodies, Lieutenant. Ask him about the creek running red. Ask him if that's the legacy you want to uphold. Hollister turned away, visibly uncomfortable. The medic will finish treating your wounds. Food will be brought shortly. He paused at the door. For what it's worth, I don't condone torture. It wasn't my choice. But you followed orders, Gideon observed. Like a good soldier. The lieutenant left without responding, the cell door closing with finality behind him. Left alone with the medic, a young private who worked in silence, Gideon tried to assess his situation objectively. His body was battered, but not broken. With food and rest, he'd recover physically. But with Singing Bird captured and the documents in Blackwood's possession, what hope remained? The medic finished his work, gathering his supplies, without meeting Gideon's eyes. Wait, Gideon said, as the young man prepared to leave. What's your name, Private? Jenkins, sir. Thomas Jenkins. Thomas, like my son. Gideon hesitated, then pressed on. Tell me, Private Jenkins, did you enlist to serve your country, to protect people? The young man nodded cautiously. And what's happening here, is this what you imagined, torturing prisoners, covering up massacres? Jenkins glanced nervously at the door. I can't talk about such things, sir. No, I suppose you can't. Gideon sighed. Just think about it, Thomas. Think about what kind of soldier you want to be remembered as. The private gathered his remaining supplies hurriedly, but paused before knocking for the guard. There's talk, he said, voice barely above a whisper, among the enlisted men, about Whispering Creek. Some say it wasn't a battle at all, that there were women, children. He swallowed hard. I don't know what to believe. Believe your conscience, Gideon advised. It's the only true compass a man has. Jenkins nodded once, then knocked. The guard opened the door, and the medic was gone. Alone again, Gideon leaned back against the cold stone wall. A small victory, perhaps planting seeds of doubt in the mind of one young soldier. But would it matter? In the end, he thought of Singing Bird captured and en route to Fort Kearny. Would she be subjected to the same interrogation he had endured? The thought made his blood run cold. And what of the documents? Blackwood would destroy them, of course, erase the evidence of his crimes and those of his powerful allies. Without them, it would be their word against that of an Apache woman and a drifter with a questionable past. No judge would listen. No newspaper would print such accusations without proof. It seemed the truth would remain buried, like the bodies at Whispering Creek, like the hopes he'd briefly allowed himself when he'd paid 12 cents for a cabin and a future. Outside, the fort's bugle sounded retreat as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Another day ending. Perhaps one of his last. Gideon closed his eyes, not in defeat, but in calculation. Singing Bird would arrive with Blackwood by nightfall. The colonel would want to end this, quickly tie up loose ends before returning to Washington with his recovered documents. That meant Gideon had hours, not days, to find a way out, not just for himself, but for Singing Bird, to somehow salvage something from this disaster. His mind turned to young Private Jenkins and his troubled conscience, to Lieutenant Hollister and his momentary doubt, to the talk among the enlisted men about Whispering Creek. Perhaps all was not lost. Perhaps there was still a card to play. As darkness fell over Fort Kearny, Gideon Hale began to plan his final gambit. Twilight settled over Fort Kearny as the cavalry patrol escorting Colonel Blackwood and his prisoner approached the main gate. Torches had been lit along the stockade walls, their flames dancing in the evening breeze. The fort stood as an island of military order in the wilderness, a symbol of American expansion, and for many of the native tribes, American betrayal. Singing Bird sat straight in her saddle despite bound wrists and hours of hard riding. Her eyes took in every detail of the fort's layout, the positions of sentries, the routines of the guards, the locations of stables and armories. Not that the information would likely be of use, but her father had taught her to always be observant, especially in enemy territory. Blackwood rode beside her, looking pleased with himself. The documents from Whispering Creek were secured in his saddlebags, along with the additional papers taken from Judge Crane's office. All evidence of the conspiracy now rested in the hands of one of its chief architects. "Impressive, isn't it?" Blackwood remarked, nodding toward the fort. "A bastion of civilization in the savage wilderness. Your people never understood the power of permanence of stone and timber set against nature's chaos." "My people understood that nothing is permanent," Singing Bird replied. "Not even empires built on lies and murder." Blackwood chuckled. "Philosophy from a dying race. How poetic." He adjusted his silver-trimmed hat. "You know, under different circumstances, I might have admired your tenacity. It's rare to find such conviction, even among my own officers." "Save your admiration, Colonel. I don't need validation from my people's executioner." "Executioner? Such dramatic language." He shook his head. "I'm a soldier, following orders, serving my country's interests. The fact that those interests conflict with your tribe's existence is unfortunate, but inevitable. Progress demands sacrifice. And who decides who is sacrificed? History decides. The strong survive, the weak perish. It's been the way of the world since time began." Blackwood's tone was almost gentle, as if explaining a simple truth to a child. "Your people had their time. Now it's ours." The gates swung open as they approached. Soldiers snapped to attention, saluting Blackwood as he rode through. Lieutenant Hollister waited in the parade ground, his expression carefully neutral as he saw Singing Bird. "Colonel," he greeted Blackwood, "I see your mission was successful." "Indeed, Lieutenant. Our Apache friend here was exactly where your father's intelligence suggested she would be." Blackwood dismounted smoothly. "How is our other guest?" "Recovering from his interrogation, sir, as you ordered." "Excellent. Have Miss Singing Bird escorted to the cell adjoining Hale's. I want them to be able to speak to each other but not touch." Psychological pressure can be more effective than physical sometimes. Hollister nodded to two soldiers who helped Singing Bird dismount and led her toward the guardhouse. As she passed Blackwood, he spoke softly. "Don't worry, my dear. You'll see your champion soon enough, though he may not be quite as you remember him." The implied threat sent a chill through her, but she maintained her composure, walking with dignity, despite her bound hands and the soldiers flanking her. The guardhouse was a squat stone building adjacent to the officers' quarters. Inside, a corridor led past several empty cells to a heavy wooden door at the far end. One of the soldiers unlocked it, revealing a small cell with a single narrow window set high in the wall. A wooden bench served as the only furniture. The adjoining cell was visible through a barred opening in the shared wall, though the interior was shrouded in shadow. "Gideon," she called softly after the soldiers had left, locking the door behind them. Movement in the darkness, then a familiar voice, hoarse but unmistakable. "Singing Bird, they caught you." He moved into the light from her cell's window, and she had to suppress a gasp. His face was bruised and cut, one eye swollen nearly shut. He moved stiffly, suggesting further injuries beneath his torn shirt. "What did they do to you?" she asked, moving closer to the bars. Hollister's idea of hospitality. Gideon attempted a smile that turned into a grimace. "Don't worry, I've had worse." "The documents. Blackwood has them, I assume." She nodded grimly. "All of them. Cedar Ridge was a trap. The deputy marshal there, Jones, he betrayed us." Gideon wasn't surprised. "Money or threats?" "Money, I think. He seemed ashamed, at least." Small comfort. Gideon leaned against the wall, clearly conserving strength. "I'm sorry, Singing Bird. I thought we could make a difference. I thought the truth would matter." "It still does?" She met his gaze through the bars. "My father believed the spirits guided you to that cabin for a reason. I believe it too." Gideon shook his head slightly. 12 cents and a war I never wanted. Some guidance. The spirits rarely explain their purposes. They simply set us on the path. She reached through the bars, her fingers stopping inches from his. "We still have a purpose, Gideon. As long as we live, as long as we remember." He almost smiled. "You sound like two ravens." "My father was a wise man." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the outer door opening. Footsteps approached, multiple sets moving with purpose. Blackwood appeared, flanked by Lieutenant Hollister and two armed guards. "How touching," the colonel observed, looking between his prisoners. The cavalry veteran and the Apache woman united in their doomed cause. He gestured to the guards. "Bring them both to my office. It's time we concluded this unfortunate business." The soldiers unlocked both cells, binding Gideon's hands before escorting them out. They were led across the parade ground to the command building where Blackwood had established his temporary headquarters. The colonel's office was well appointed, with maps of the territory covering one wall and a large desk dominating the space. A portrait of President Grant hung behind the desk, watching the proceedings with painted eyes. Blackwood seated himself, gesturing for the prisoners to be positioned before him. Lieutenant Hollister stood to one side, his expression increasingly troubled. "Well," Blackwood began, "here we are, the end of our little drama." He patted a stack of documents on his desk, the evidence they had fought so hard to preserve. "I must admit you've been formidable adversaries. Few have caused me such inconvenience." "Glad to have troubled your sleep, Colonel," Gideon replied dryly. "Oh, I've slept quite well, actually. The inevitability of victory has that effect." Blackwood leaned back in his chair. "But I'm not without appreciation for worthy opponents, which is why I've decided to offer you both a choice." "What kind of choice?" Singing Bird asked warily. "A simple one. Between a quick, dignified death tonight or a public hanging in liberty 1 week from now, after a trial for treason murder and various other charges we'll concoct. He smiled thinly. The outcome is the same, but the journey differs considerably. Gideon laughed, despite his injuries. That's your idea of mercy, quick death or slow humiliation. It's more than most in your position would receive. Blackwood's eyes hardened. You've disrupted operations worth millions of dollars. You've threatened the reputations and careers of powerful men. By rights, I should have you both flayed alive and left for the crows. Then why don't you, Singing Bird challenged, professional courtesy in Mr. Hale's case? He was a soldier once, after all. Blackwood turned to Gideon. And as for your Apache friend, well, let's call it a gentleman's prerogative to show gallantry to a lady, even an enemy one. Lieutenant Hollister shifted uncomfortably. Sir, about the charges, there's no evidence linking either prisoner to Sheriff Miller's death. And without evidence... Evidence can be arranged, Lieutenant. Blackwood cut him off sharply. Witnesses found, testimonies secured. The legal niceties will be observed, I assure you. That's not justice, sir. Justice? Blackwood's laugh was cold. This isn't about justice, Lieutenant. It's about necessity. About protecting this nation's interests and its future. He gestured to the maps on the wall. Everything west of the Mississippi minerals timberland for settlements and railways, all of it depends on dealing decisively with obstacles, including human obstacles. Like the Apache at Whispering Creek, Gideon asked quietly. Women and children, were they obstacles too? Colonel Blackwood's face hardened. War has casualties, Hale. You know that better than most. That wasn't war. It was slaughter. Call it what you will. Blackwood rose, circling his desk to stand before them. The point remains. History is shaped by men willing to do what others cannot stomach. Men like myself, Senator Hollister, Governor Webb. Men who understand that empire requires bloodied hands. And what about men like Lieutenant Hollister here? Gideon nodded toward the young officer. Does he understand what he's part of, the lies he's defending? Hollister looked distinctly uncomfortable now, avoiding Gideon's gaze. The lieutenant follows orders, Blackwood replied. As all good soldiers do. I followed orders once, Gideon said, addressing Hollister directly. Followed them right into a nightmare I've never escaped. There are some orders a man shouldn't obey, Lieutenant. Some lines he shouldn't cross no matter whose name is on the paper. That's enough, Blackwood snapped. He turned to the guards. Take them back to their cells. I'll give them until dawn to decide between my two generous offers. As they were led out, Gideon caught Hollister's eye one last time. Something passed between them, a moment of recognition, perhaps, or the seedling of doubt taking root. Back in the cells, with the door locked behind them, Singing Bird moved close to the bars separating them. "The lieutenant," she whispered. "He's wavering." Gideon nodded slightly. "Maybe, but not enough to help us, I fear. What will we do? Die with dignity, I suppose?" He smiled grimly. "Unless you've got an Apache miracle hidden somewhere." She matched his smile with her own. The spirits work in mysterious ways. From inside her sleeve, she withdrew a small object, a slender metal pin. "Clara Hayes gave me this before we left Redemption. Said it might come in handy if I found myself in restrictive circumstances." Gideon's eyes widened slightly. "A lockpick. Can you use it? Samuel Hartwell taught me many things. Opening locks was among them." She concealed the pick again. "But even if we escape these cells, we're still inside a fort with 100 armed soldiers. And the documents are still in Blackwood's possession," Gideon added grimly. Without them, we have nothing but accusations. They fell silent, each lost in thought. Outside the fort, settled into its nighttime routine, changing of guards, lamps being lit, soldiers heading to the mess hall for evening meal. There might be a way, Gideon said finally. Not to escape, exactly, but to be heard. I'm listening. The young private who treated my injuries, Jenkins. He has doubts about Whispering Creek, and he's not the only one from what he said. There's talk among the enlisted men. Singing Bird considered this. Could he help us? Possibly, if he's brave enough. Gideon moved closer to the bars. But we'd need to get a message to him, and even then, it's a long shot. A long shot is better than no shot. She pulled the lockpick from her sleeve again. Let me work on these cell doors. When the night guard makes his rounds, we'll find a way to pass a message to Jenkins. As Singing Bird began working on her lock, Gideon turned his thoughts to what message might possibly sway a young soldier to risk his career. Perhaps his life to help them. The truth about Whispering Creek. An appeal to conscience. Or something more tangible, outside full darkness had fallen. Fort Kearny slept unaware of the desperate plan taking shape within its guardhouse walls. Dawn was still hours away when the cell door quietly swung open. Singing Bird slipped out, moving to Gideon's cell to work on his lock. Minutes later, they stood together in the corridor, listening intently for any sound of approaching guards. The night patrol passed 20 minutes ago, Gideon whispered. We have perhaps another 20 before they return. They moved silently through the guardhouse toward the outer door. Singing Bird's skill with the lockpick made short work of it, and soon they stood in the cool night air pressed against the building's shadow. The fort was eerily quiet. A few lamps burned in the officers' quarters, and sentries patrolled the walls, but the parade ground was deserted. The enlisted men's barracks. Gideon indicated a long, low building across the parade ground. Private Jenkins should be there, but crossing the open ground— Wait! Singing Bird touched his arm. Look! A figure emerged from the officers' quarters, moving with purpose toward the command building where Blackwood had his office. Even in the dim light, Lieutenant Hollister's rigid military bearing was unmistakable. What's he doing at this hour? Gideon wondered. Something doesn't feel right, Singing Bird murmured. We should follow him. They skirted the edge of the parade ground, keeping to shadows, watching as Hollister entered the command building. A light appeared in Blackwood's office window. I need to hear what they're saying, Gideon decided. Stay here. Before Singing Bird could protest, he moved quickly across the remaining distance, positioning himself beneath the office window. It was open slightly, allowing voices to drift out into the night. Cannot be part of this, Colonel. Hollister's voice tense with emotion. It goes against everything I swore to uphold. Don't be dramatic, Lieutenant. Blackwood sounding irritated at being disturbed. You're a soldier. You follow orders. Orders to massacre civilians, to falsify reports, to execute prisoners without trial. Hollister's voice rose slightly. I've read the documents, sir. All of them, including your letters to my father discussing how to eliminate the Apache problem permanently. Silence then. Blackwood's voice dangerously soft. You went through my private papers. That's a court-martial offense, Lieutenant. So is conspiracy to commit murder. So is falsifying official records. So is lying to Congress about territorial affairs. Papers rustled. I've made copies, Colonel, of everything. If anything happens to me, or to the prisoners, they go to the Chicago Tribune and the New York Herald. Gideon could almost hear Blackwood's calculating mind working. When the colonel spoke again, his tone was conciliatory. James, Let's be reasonable. You're upset, understandably. The realities of frontier administration can be distasteful to idealistic young officers. But consider your future, your father's position, the family name. My family name. Hollister laughed bitterly. Built on the bodies of women and children at Whispering Creek, on stolen land, and forged documents. That's not a legacy I want any part of, sir. What exactly do you want, Lieutenant? Justice. The prisoners are to be released unharmed. The documents returned to them. And you, Colonel, will resign your commission and face a military tribunal for what happened at Whispering Creek. Impossible, Blackwood scoffed. Even if I agreed, which I don't, the governor, your father, half of Washington, would ensure it never happened. Then we'll take it to the people, the newspapers, the courts. Hollister's voice hardened. One way or another, the truth comes out. The truth, Blackwood sounded almost sad. The truth is that this nation was built on blood and bone, Lieutenant. On hard men making harder choices. You think the Apache are the first to be sacrificed on the altar of progress? They won't be the last either. That doesn't make it right. Right, wrong, these are luxuries, boy. Empires aren't built on moral platitudes. A long silence followed. Then Hollister again, his voice quiet but firm. I've made my decision, Colonel. Release the prisoners, surrender the documents, face a tribunal. Or I send my copies to every newspaper from here to New York. I see. Blackwood's tone had changed, becoming almost gentle. You leave me no choice, then. A shot rang out deafening in the small office. Then another. Gideon flinched, instinctively pressing closer to the wall beneath the window. Above, a body slumped heavily to the floor. Pity, came Blackwood's voice, followed by the sound of a revolver being holstered. You had potential, James. Footsteps moved across the office, then the door opened and closed. Blackwood was leaving. Gideon risked a glance through the window. Lieutenant Hollister lay sprawled across the floor, blood pooling beneath him. On Blackwood's desk lay the documents, all of them, including what appeared to be Hollister's copies. Making a split-second decision, Gideon pulled himself through the window into the office. He checked Hollister first, dead 2 bullets to the chest. The young lieutenant's face looked peaceful, almost relieved. I'm sorry, Gideon murmured, closing the staring eyes. You found your line too late. He gathered the documents quickly, including Hollister's copies, which showed signs of having been made in haste. As he turned to leave, his eye caught something else on the desk, a telegraph form partially completed. It was addressed to Senator Hollister in Washington, informing him that his son had died heroically defending the fort against Apache raiders. The same fate, Gideon realized, likely planned for him and Singing Bird. A perfect cover story. A grieving father with political power. A renewed call for military action against the tribes. History neatly arranged to serve the Empire's needs. Gideon stuffed the telegraph form in with the other documents and moved to the window. Singing Bird was there, helping him out just as shouts erupted from the direction of the guardhouse. Their escape had been discovered. Hollister's dead, Gideon told her as they ran for the shadows. Blackwood shot him, but I got the documents, all of them. Alarm bells began to ring throughout the fort. Lanterns flared to life, and the pounding of boots echoed across the parade ground. We need horses, Singing Bird said, as they pressed themselves against the stable wall. No time, Gideon replied. They will have the gates covered. We need another way out. There, she pointed to the northwest corner of the fort, where supply wagons were parked near a secondary gate. The delivery entrance. It might be less guarded. They moved carefully from shadow to shadow, avoiding the growing number of soldiers emerging from barracks and quarters. The alarm had the fort in chaos, with conflicting orders being shouted and men rushing in all directions. At the supply gate, a single sentry stood watch, looking more confused than alert. Gideon approached silently from behind, subduing him with a chokehold until the man lost consciousness. Singing Bird, meanwhile, worked on the gate's heavy lock. "Got it," she whispered as the mechanism yielded to her pick. They slipped through, finding themselves on a narrow trail, leading down from the fort toward the river. Behind them, the chaos continued, but no immediate pursuit had been organized. Yet, the alarm still focused on the missing prisoners, not the murdered lieutenant. The river, Gideon decided, moving as quickly as his injured body would allow. If we can find a boat, the current will carry us faster than they can follow on horseback. They half ran, half slid down the steep path to the Missouri's banks. The river flowed dark and swift, swollen by recent rains. At a small landing, several rowboats were tethered, used by the fort's fishermen and for ferrying supplies from river steamers. "Can you row?" Gideon asked as they untied one of the boats. "Better than you can in your condition," Singing Bird replied, helping him aboard before taking up the oars. They pushed off into the current just as shouts echoed from the path above. Lantern light appeared at the top of the bluff, moving rapidly downward. "They've found the sentry," Gideon observed grimly. "And probably Hollister by now." Singing Bird rowed powerfully, guiding the boat into the main channel where the current would give them additional speed. Behind them, more shouts, and then the crack of rifles. Bullets splashed into the water around them, but the darkness and distance made accuracy impossible. Soon they were beyond effective range, the current carrying them swiftly downstream. Fort Kearny's lights receded, becoming distant pinpricks against the night sky. "Where do we go now?" Singing Bird asked, still rowing to add to their speed. "Cedar Ridge is compromised. Liberty is Blackwood's territory." Gideon clutched the precious documents against his chest, considering. "St. Louis," he decided. "There's a newspaper editor there, Harrison Wheeler of the Missouri Gazette. Honest man, fearless. I did him a favor once years ago. St. Louis is hundreds of miles. We follow the river. It'll take us there eventually." Singing Bird nodded, settling into a steady rowing rhythm. "And Blackwood. He'll come after us, with everything he has." Gideon looked back toward the fort, now invisible in the darkness. "He can't afford not to with what we're carrying." They fell silent, each absorbed in their own thoughts, as the boat carried them through the night. The documents, the truth about Whispering Creek, about the land fraud, about Washington's complicity in it all, rested securely between them. Whether that truth would ever see daylight remained to be seen. Whether they would live to deliver it, equally uncertain. But for the first time since Gideon had laid down his 12 cents on the auctioneer's table, he felt something like peace. He had found his line, the one he wouldn't cross. Found it again, rather after losing it somewhere between Gettysburg and Dodge City. "What are you thinking?" Singing Bird asked, noticing his expression in the faint moonlight. "About that cabin. 12 cents seemed like a bargain at the time." She smiled slightly. "And now?" "Now I think it might be the best purchase I ever made." He met her gaze, though the cost turned out to be higher than advertised. "Some things are worth the price," she replied softly. The Missouri carried them onward through the night, two fugitives with a boatload of dangerous truth, pursued by powerful men with everything to lose. The odds were long, the journey perilous. But as dawn broke over the eastern horizon, painting the river in shades of gold and crimson, Gideon Hale found himself hoping, truly hoping for the first time in years. Hope for justice. Hope for truth. hope for a future beyond the blood and shadows of the past. Whether that hope would be realized remained in the hands of fate, or perhaps the spirits two ravens had spoken of. But for now, it was enough to be moving forward with purpose, with honor restored. 12 cents had bought him more than a cabin. It had bought him redemption. And that Gideon reflected as the sun rose fully above the horizon was beyond price.